In the soft glow of a kerosene lamp on a warm June evening, Anna traced the worn creases of her husband's last letter with calloused fingers, her heart catching on every word as if the paper itself might reveal what the future refused to say. She sat at the rough wooden table in their small house on the edge of a village near the western border, the scent of fresh bread still lingering from the afternoon bake. Outside, the summer air carried the familiar sounds of crickets and the distant lowing of cows being brought in for the night. Her two children, 8-year-old Pavel and little Irina, played quietly on the floor with wooden soldiers their father had carved the winter before. Anna folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the drawer where she kept all his notes from the border post. He wrote every few days when he could, simple lines about the weather, about missing her cooking, about how the river looked peaceful in the evenings. He never mentioned the German soldiers he sometimes saw across the wire, or the way their numbers seemed to grow with each passing week. Anna had learned not to ask too many questions when he came home on leave. The leaders in Moscow had promised peace through the agreement with Germany. Everyone said it would hold. And yet, in the quiet moments when the children slept, she found herself listening to the wind a little too carefully. She rose and moved to the stove, stirring the pot of cabbage soup that would be their supper. The rhythm of these small tasks had always steadied her. Kneading dough, mending shirts, tucking the children in with the same story about the clever fox and the bear. But lately the rhythm felt thinner, like a thread pulled too tight. Neighbors whispered when they met at the well. A traveler from the next district had mentioned seeing long lines of covered trucks moving west at night. Anna's husband had come home 2 weeks earlier for a short visit and held her longer than usual at the door when he left. He had looked at the children as if memorizing their faces. She had pretended not to notice the way his hands trembled just slightly when he lit his cigarette. Across the invisible line that divided their world from another, a 19-year-old German soldier named Karl sat on the edge of his cot in a pine forest encampment, the same letter paper balanced on his knee. The canvas of the tent glowed faintly from the lantern outside. Around him, his comrades played cards and sang softly, their voices carrying the easy confidence of young men who believed history had chosen them for something grand. Karl dipped his pen and began again. "Dear Mother," he wrote, then stopped. He had already filled 2 pages with descriptions of the countryside, the way the birch trees glowed in the evening light, the taste of the strong tea they drank before drills. He wanted to tell her the truth, that the land felt too big, that the stories his grandfather had told about the last war in the East had begun to sit differently in his stomach. But he wrote instead about duty and about how proud he was to be part of something that would secure a future for German families like theirs. He signed it with the same careful script he had used since school, then folded the letter and tucked it inside his tunic where it would stay until the next mail collection. Karl stepped outside into the cool night air. The forest smelled of resin and damp earth. In the distance, he could hear the low rumble of engines as more vehicles arrived under cover of darkness. Officers spoke in low voices about the great task ahead, about clearing space for German settlers, about destroying the Bolshevik threat once and for all. Karl listened and nodded when spoken to, but in the privacy of his own thoughts he wondered what the Russian mothers on the other side of the coming line were doing right now. He thought of his own mother's kitchen, the way she always left the window open so the scent of lilacs could drift in during summer. He wondered if Russian kitchens smelled the same. Back in the village, Anna called the children to the table. Pavel asked if Papa would be home soon for the harvest. Anna smiled and said they would see, the way mothers do when they cannot promise anything. They ate quietly, the clink of spoons against bowls the only sound for a while. After the meal, she washed the dishes by the basin while Irina hummed a song she had learned at school. Pavel sat by the window and watched the last light fade from the sky. Anna noticed how still he had become lately, how he no longer ran to the fields with the same wild energy. Children sense what adults try to hide. She dried her hands and went to him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Come," she said softly. "Help me close the shutters." Outside, the sky had turned the deep blue of early night. A train whistle sounded far away, the kind that usually carried goods or soldiers on leave. Anna paused with her hand on the wooden shutter. For a moment she imagined she could hear the breathing of the land itself, the vast field stretching west toward whatever was gathering there. She thought of all the letters her husband had written over the years, the way his handwriting had grown steadier even as the world around them changed. She wondered what he would write tonight if he could, and whether the paper would ever reach her if the rumors proved true. In the German encampment, Carl lay awake long after the others had quieted. He listened to the night sounds of the forest and tried to picture the faces of the men he would soon face. He had been told they were subhuman, dangerous, part of a system that threatened everything decent. But the grandfather who had fought here before had spoken of Russian soldiers as men who endured, who loved their land fiercely, who fought harder when pushed to the edge. Carl turned on his side and touched the letter in his tunic again. He had not sealed it yet. There was still time to add one more line, something true that his mother would understand even if the censors did not. Anna finished closing the shutters and turned back to the room. The children were already in their beds, whispering to each other in the dark the way siblings do when they sense change but cannot name it. She sat on the edge of Pavel's bed and smoothed his hair. "Sleep now," she whispered. "Tomorrow is another day." He nodded, but his eyes stayed open a moment longer than usual. Anna moved to Irina's bed and kissed her forehead. The little girl reached up and touched her mother's cheek with one small hand, then turned toward the wall and was soon breathing the deep, even breaths of childhood sleep. Anna returned to the table and sat in the lamplight. She took out her husband's letter once more and read it slowly, as if the words might change if she looked long enough. Outside, the crickets continued their steady song. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked once and fell silent. The village slept, or tried to. Across the fields and forests that would soon become a battlefield, thousands of other families performed the same small rituals of evening, closing shutters, folding letters, kissing children good night, unaware that the ground beneath their ordinary lives was about to shift forever. These were the hours when history still wore the face of the everyday. A mother saving a crust of bread for her husband's return. A young soldier wondering whether his mother would recognize the man he was becoming. A border guard on night duty who noticed the unusual number of lights moving on the far side of the river but filed his report and was told to stand down, not to provoke. The agreement signed years earlier had promised that war would not come again so soon. It had allowed fields to be planted and children to grow and letters to travel between homes that believed themselves safe. Yet in those same hours, trains continued their quiet movement, men continued to write the things they could not say aloud, and mothers continued to listen to the wind with a new kind of attention. Anna blew out the lamp and lay down beside her sleeping children. She kept one hand on Pavel's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. In the darkness she thought of all the nights she had done the same when he was smaller, when the only fears were scraped knees and bad dreams. Now the fears had no shape she could name, only a heaviness that settled in her chest each time she heard a train or saw dust on the western road. She closed her eyes and tried to picture her husband's face as it had looked the last time he stood in this doorway. She held the image until sleep finally came, thin and uneasy. In the forest encampment, Carl finally sealed his letter and placed it with the others to be collected at dawn. He stepped outside one last time before sleep. The night air was cool against his face. He looked east, toward the darkness that hid the villages and fields and families like Anna's. For a moment he allowed himself to wonder what those families were doing right now, whether their children were already asleep, whether their mothers were still sitting at tables with letters in their hands. Then he turned back toward the tent, because wondering too much was dangerous when morning would bring orders. These were the last quiet hours before everything changed. The letters that would never be answered, the good-night kisses that would have to last for years, the small kindnesses between neighbors that would soon be tested beyond recognition. On both sides of the coming line, ordinary people carried the same fragile hopes, that their children would grow up in peace, that the letters would keep coming, that the world they knew would still be there when they opened their eyes in the morning. They could not yet see how those hopes would be forged into something harder and more enduring than any agreement signed on paper. They only knew that tonight, for one more night, the crickets sang and the lamps were lit and the children slept in their beds. If these quiet moments of courage before the storm move you the way they move me, I want to offer you a way to honor the men and women who lived them. Many listeners have told me they want to hold a tangible piece of that history, something that connects them directly to the personal stories behind the great events. That is why I recommend exploring authentic World War II memorabilia, items that once belonged to soldiers and families like the ones we've walked with tonight, or settling in to experience the powerful human drama of the film Midway on Prime Video, which captures the same spirit of sacrifice and the global fight against tyranny that defined the Eastern Front as well. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As Anna lay in the darkness with her hand on her son's back, and as Carl sealed the letter he hoped would one day reach his mother, neither of them knew that the world they were trying to protect with these small acts of love was already slipping away. What they did know, in the quiet language of the heart, was that some things must be held onto even when everything else is about to break. Those ordinary evenings, those folded letters, those goodnight whispers, they were the last threads of a life that would soon be measured in survival rather than in harvests and school lessons. And it is in remembering how fiercely ordinary people clung to those threads that we begin to understand the true cost of what came next. The first explosion tore the night open like a wound that would never close, hurling Anna from her bed and into a darkness suddenly alive with fire and sound. She reached for the children before her mind caught up with her body. Pavel was already sitting upright, eyes wide, and searching hers for an answer she did not have. Irina clung to her nightdress, small fingers digging into the fabric. Outside, the sky had turned an unnatural orange. Another blast shook the walls. Dust sifted down from the rafters onto the table where Anna had folded her husband's letter only hours earlier. She gathered both children against her chest and stayed low, the way her own mother had taught her during the old stories of distant wars. But those had been stories. This was the floorboards trembling beneath her knees and the smell of burning wood already drifting through the cracks in the shutters. She crawled to the window and lifted one slat with trembling fingers. The village that had been quiet at dusk was now a place of running shadows and distant shouts. A barn at the far end of the street was already engulfed, its roof collapsing inward with a roar that made Irina bury her face deeper into Anna's shoulder. Another wave of planes passed overhead, their engines a steady, merciless drone that seemed to press the air itself downward. Anna had never heard so many engines at once. They sounded like a river in flood, except the river was made of metal and fire. In the border post a few kilometers west, her husband woke to the same sound but from much closer. The first shells had landed among the wooden barracks before most of the men could reach their rifles. He rolled from his cot and pressed himself against the wall as the world outside became a continuous roar. Men he had shared tea with only the night before lay still in the dirt between the buildings. Others shouted orders that no one could hear over the explosions. He grabbed his rifle and helmet, his hands moving from years of training even as his mind struggled to accept that the agreement, the one everyone had trusted, had meant nothing at all. A young soldier beside him, barely old enough to shave, was crying openly as he tried to tie his boots with shaking fingers. Anna's husband reached over without thinking and steadied the boy's hands, the small act of kindness the only thing he could offer in the middle of the breaking world. Across the line that had just been erased, Carl stood in the open hatch of his vehicle as the first light of dawn revealed what their artillery and bombers had already begun. The ground ahead was churned and smoking. He had expected resistance, perhaps even a prepared defense. Instead he saw figures running in every direction, some in uniform, some in the simple clothes of farmers and villagers. A woman carrying a child stumbled across a field that had been a peaceful stretch of green the evening before. Carl watched her fall when a burst of fire stitched the earth nearby. He felt his stomach turn but kept his eyes forward because the men around him were cheering, because the orders had been clear, because stopping to think was dangerous when the world was moving this fast. Back in the village, Anna made a decision that would shape every hour that followed. She could not stay in the house. The fires were spreading too quickly and the planes kept coming. She wrapped Irina in a blanket, took Pavel by the hand, and led them toward the small root cellar behind the house. The ground shook again as they crossed the yard. A neighbor, an old woman who had always shared her extra eggs, was trying to pull a trunk from her doorway. Anna stopped without thinking, handed Irina to Pavel for a moment, and helped the woman drag the trunk to the side of the road. There was no time for words. The old woman's eyes met hers for one long second, and in that look passed everything they both understood and could not say. Then Anna took her children and kept moving. Inside the root cellar the air was cool and smelled of earth and potatoes. Anna pulled the heavy door mostly closed, leaving a narrow gap for light and air. She sat with her back against the wall, one arm around each child, and listened to the world above them come apart. Pavel asked in a small voice if Papa would find them here. Anna said yes because that was what mothers said when they did not know. She thought of the letter in the drawer upstairs and wondered if it would still be there when this was over, or if the house itself would be gone. She thought of all the morning she had sent her husband off with a kiss and a wrapped piece of bread, never imagining that one day the sky itself would open and try to swallow everything they had built. The first hours were the cruelest because they offered no pattern, no way to understand what was happening. The attacks seemed to come from everywhere at once. In the border post, Anna's husband and the surviving men were ordered to fall back to a secondary line. They moved through smoke and confusion, stepping over bodies that had been friends at supper the night before. The young soldier who had been crying earlier was now silent, his face set in a way that made him look older. Anna's husband kept thinking of his family in the village behind them. He did not know if they were still in the house or if they had already started running. Every step away from them felt like a betrayal, yet the orders left no choice. He touched the small photograph he carried in his pocket, Anna and the children standing in front of the house on a summer day, and whispered their names once under his breath before the next barrage forced them all to the ground again. Carl's unit advanced through the first shattered positions as the sun climbed higher. The destruction was more complete than he had imagined. Villages that had still been asleep at midnight were now columns of smoke. He saw a man in a nightshirt standing in the middle of a road, staring at the burning remains of what had been his home, too stunned to move even when vehicles passed close by. Carl looked away because looking too long made the cheering of his comrades sound wrong. He thought of the letter he had sealed only hours earlier and wondered whether his mother would ever read the part where he had written about the birch trees glowing in the evening light. That world already felt like something from another lifetime. By mid-morning the refugee columns had begun. Families who had managed to gather a few belongings walked east along the roads, carrying bundles on their backs or pushing carts loaded with whatever they could save. Anna emerged from the cellar with the children when the plane seemed to have moved on for a time. She joined a small group of neighbors heading toward a larger town where they hoped there might be trains or officials who could tell them what to do. Irina walked between her and Pavel, holding both their hands. The little girl had stopped crying. Her face was streaked with soot and dirt, but her eyes were steady in a way that broke Anna's heart. Children learn quickly when there is no other choice. Along the way they passed the first clear signs of what this day meant. A farmhouse burned with no one trying to save it. In the yard lay a man and a woman who had clearly tried to reach the fields. Anna kept the children moving, shielding their view with her body when she could. An older man walking near them carried a small wooden box that he held against his chest like a child. When someone asked what was inside, he said only that it was all he had left of his wife. No one asked more. In these first hours, grief was still too new to share easily. At the border post the surviving defenders had reached a shallow trench line that had been prepared months earlier but never truly believed necessary. Anna's husband found a moment to catch his breath and check the photograph again. The paper was already smudged from his fingers. He thought of Anna closing the shutters the night before, of the way she had looked at him as if trying to memorize his face the way he had memorized hers. He did not know that at that same moment she was walking east with their children, or that the house they had shared was now part of the smoke rising behind the advancing line. Carl watched the columns of refugees from his position and felt something shift inside him that he could not yet name. The briefings had spoken of a quick campaign, of a people who would welcome liberation from their own leaders. What he saw instead were families carrying their lives on their backs, moving away from the direction his own army was coming. He thought of his own home, of the way his mother had stood at the door when he left, and for the first time the distance between those two images felt unbearable. He said nothing to the men around him. There was no language yet for what he was beginning to understand. By afternoon the sky had cleared enough for the sun to shine on a changed landscape. The first hours of the invasion had already carved new paths across the earth, tank tracks through fields that had been ready for harvest, craters where houses had stood, lines of people walking with no clear destination except away. Anna and the children reached a small crossroads where officials were trying to organize transport. There were no trains yet. Someone said they should keep walking toward the next district center. Anna nodded and kept moving because stopping felt like giving the planes permission to find them again. In the trench line, Anna's husband and the others prepared for whatever would come next. The young soldier who had cried that morning now sat quietly cleaning his rifle with the same careful attention he had once given to his schoolbooks. Anna's husband watched him and thought of Pavel at home, of how quickly boys learned to do what needed to be done when the world demanded it. He touched the photograph once more, then tucked it away and rose to his feet as new orders came down the line. The sun was lower in the sky when Anna finally allowed herself to rest for a few minutes beside the road. She sat with Irina in her lap and Pavel leaning against her side. The little girl had fallen into an exhausted sleep. Pavel watched the road with eyes that already looked older than they had the day before. Anna thought of all the evenings she had told them stories to help them sleep, stories about clever animals and brave children who always found their way home. She wondered what story she would tell tonight if they found a place to stop, and whether any story could make sense of what they had already seen. Farther west, Carl's unit paused to refuel and receive new instructions. He stepped away from the vehicles for a moment and looked back toward the horizon they had crossed that morning. The smoke from the first villages still rose in dark columns. He thought of the woman he had seen fall in the field, of the man standing in the road in his nightshirt, of all the letters that would never reach the people who had written them in the quiet hours before dawn. He did not yet have words for what he felt, but he knew that the version of this day he would write home, if he wrote at all, would be different from the one he was living. These first hours had already taught everyone who lived them that nothing would ever be the same. The agreement that had promised safety had been broken in the space of a single night. Families that had closed their shutters and kissed their children goodnight had woken to a world where the sky itself had become the enemy. Young men who had written letters about duty and future now stepped over the bodies of friends and wondered what future remained. And in the spaces between the explosions and the running, small acts of humanity continued, a hand steadying another's, a shared piece of bread, a mother shielding her children with her own body. Because even when the world burned, those instincts did not die easily. The columns kept moving east. The defenders kept falling back. The advancing forces kept pushing forward. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, ordinary people carried the weight of love and fear that no order or agreement could touch. Anna walked with her children because that was what she could still do. Her husband held his position because that was what duty required. Carl advanced because the machine he was part of had already begun to turn, even if part of him had already begun to question where it would stop. None of them knew how long this day would stretch into weeks and months and years, or how many more mornings would begin with the same question of whether they would see another sunset. What they did know, in the raw language of survival, was that the life they had known had ended with the first explosion. Everything that came after would be measured against these first hours, against the sound of the sky raining fire, against the feel of a child's hand in theirs, against the memory of a letter folded on a table that might no longer exist. And it was in those measurements, made by ordinary hearts in the middle of extraordinary ruin, that the true story of what began on this day would be written. If the raw truth of these opening hours, the terror, the confusion, the small defiant acts of care that persisted even as everything burned, has stayed with you the way it stays with me, then I want to share something that lets you see what words alone can never fully capture. For those of you who want to witness the unfiltered reality behind these stories, there is a special digital collection available that gathers rare, uncensored photographs and footage from the Eastern Front. Images and accounts too raw and powerful for platforms like this one to host openly. It reveals the true face of war's brutality and the humanity that somehow endured inside it. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the sun finally sank on that first terrible day, the fires continued to glow along the horizon. Anna and her children found shelter in a barn with other families who had walked the same road. They shared what little food they had carried and spoke in low voices about husbands and fathers still somewhere behind them. In the trench line, Anna's husband ate a cold ration and touched the photograph once more before trying to sleep. In his vehicle, Carl stared at the darkening sky and thought of birch trees glowing in evening light that already felt impossibly far away. None of them knew what the next dawn would bring, only that they would face it carrying the same fragile hopes that had been tested from the very first explosion. And that, more than any map or order, was what would determine how this story continued. The column stretched farther than any man could see, a slow river of dust and exhaustion winding through fields that had once promised harvest, each step pulling the captured farther from everything they had been only days before. Sergei walked near the middle of that river, his boots heavy with the dirt of roads he had once known as a boy. His hands were empty now. The rifle he had carried since the first hours of the invasion lay somewhere behind him in the grass where he had finally let it fall. Around him, thousands of others moved in the same weary rhythm, men in torn uniforms, some with bandages made from shirt sleeves, others supporting comrades who could barely stand. The sun beat down without mercy, and the only sounds were the shuffle of feet, the occasional cough, and the low voices of the guards riding alongside on motorcycles or walking with rifles slung. Sergei kept his eyes on the back of the man in front of him, a tall farmer from a village not far from his own. They had spoken only once, in the first hours after the surrender, when the farmer had shared a crust of bread he had hidden in his pocket. That small kindness had felt like a lifeline then. Now it was the memory Sergei held onto when the thirst became too sharp and the shame threatened to pull him under. He had not wanted to raise his hands. When the German tanks had closed the last gap in the encirclement, Sergei and the men around him had fought until the ammunition ran out and the orders stopped coming. They had been told to hold, to wait for relief that never arrived. In the end, the choice had been between dying in a shallow trench or living to see what came next. Sergei had chosen to live, and the weight of that choice sat in his chest like a stone. He thought of his mother in the small house near the border, of the way she had pressed a bundle of food into his hands the morning he left. He wondered if she had heard the news yet, if she was still waiting by the window the way she had waited for his father years earlier. The thought of her not knowing whether he was alive or already lying in one of the fields they had crossed made every step heavier. Beside him, a younger soldier named Pavel, barely 18, with the soft face of someone who had still been in school when the call came, stumbled and nearly fell. Sergei caught his arm without thinking, the same instinctive reach he had used when his own younger brother had tripped during harvest. Pavel muttered thanks and straightened, but his eyes stayed down. They had been marching since dawn, and the heat rose from the road in waves that blurred the horizon. Guards shouted occasionally when the column slowed too much, but most of the time they rode in silence, their faces tired and unreadable. Sergei had noticed one guard in particular, a man not much older than himself who sometimes looked at the prisoners with something other than contempt. That morning the guard had passed a canteen to a man who had collapsed, holding it while the prisoner drank before moving on without a word. It was a small thing, almost nothing against the scale of what was happening, but Sergei had seen it and stored it away like the crust of bread. The pockets had formed quickly in those first weeks, whole armies caught between the advancing lines like fish in a closing net. Sergei had been part of one of the largest. They had fought hard at first, believing the stories that relief was coming, that the leaders would not abandon them. But the days had stretched and the supplies had dwindled, and eventually the fighting had become about staying alive one more hour rather than winning anything. When the end came, it had felt almost quiet, a gradual realization that there was nowhere left to go and no one left to give orders that mattered. Men had burned their papers and maps, not out of defiance but out of a simple need to keep something of themselves private from whatever came next. Sergei had kept only a small photograph of his family and a letter from his mother that he had read so many times the creases were soft as cloth. As the column passed through a village that had already been touched by the fighting, women and children stood at the edges of the road watching. Some turned away. Others held out pieces of bread or buckets of water when the guards were not looking. Sergei saw an old woman press a piece of dark bread into the hand of a prisoner near the front. The man took it without stopping, his eyes never leaving the road ahead. These small exchanges happened in silence, as if everyone understood that words could break the fragile thread of mercy. Sergei thought of his own village and wondered if the same scenes were playing out there, his mother perhaps standing with a bucket, his younger brother watching soldiers pass. The thought both comforted and hurt him. He wanted them to be safe, yet the idea that they might be seeing what he was seeing now made his throat tighten. The German soldier who had shared his canteen earlier rode his motorcycle slowly along the edge of the column. His name was Karl, though none of the prisoners knew it. He had been part of the advance that closed this particular pocket, and the sight of so many men walking with empty hands had stayed with him longer than he expected. In training they had been told the enemy would fight to the last man, that surrender was weakness. What Karl saw instead were tired faces that looked like the faces of men from his own village, fathers and sons and brothers who had simply run out of choices. He had passed the canteen without thinking that morning, the same way he would have offered water to a neighbor's horse on a hot day. Now, as the afternoon wore on, he found himself watching for the man he had helped, hoping he was still on his feet. For Sergei and the others, the march was teaching them the first lessons of captivity. Thirst came in waves that made the tongue swell and the mind drift to rivers and wells from home. Hunger followed close behind, a dull ache that never left. The dust coated everything, hair, skin, the inside of the mouth, until swallowing became an effort. Some men talked quietly among themselves, sharing fragments of what they had seen or stories of their families to keep the silence from swallowing them whole. Others walked in a kind of daze, their eyes fixed on nothing. Sergei tried to stay present. He counted his steps sometimes, or focused on the back of the tall farmer in front of him. When Pavel stumbled again, Sergei steadied him and spoke for the first time in hours. "Keep your eyes on the next bend in the road," he said quietly. Just the next bend. The words were simple, but they gave both of them something to hold. Night fell without warning, the way it does on long summer days. The column was herded into a large open field surrounded by a few strands of wire and guarded by men who looked as exhausted as the prisoners. There was no food that first night, only water from a single well that the guards allowed them to use in small groups. Sergei found a patch of grass near the tall farmer and Pavel. They sat close together, not speaking much, the warmth of other bodies a small comfort against the cooling air. In the darkness, whispered conversations rose and fell like wind through grass. One man near them was trying to remember the words to a song his wife had sung at their wedding. Another spoke of the letter he had been carrying and how he had burned it rather than let it fall into strange hands. Sergei took out his mother's letter and held it carefully, running his thumb along the familiar handwriting without unfolding it. He did not need to read the words again. He knew them by heart. Carl sat with his own unit a short distance away, eating cold rations and listening to the low murmur from the field. The scale of what they had accomplished in these early weeks was hard to grasp even for those who had been part of it. Entire formations had been cut off and forced to surrender, tens of thousands of men now walking toward camps that had not existed a month earlier. Carl thought of the woman he had seen fall in the field during the first advance, of the man standing in the road in his nightshirt, and now of this endless column. He wondered what would happen to all of them when they reached wherever they were being taken. The briefings had not prepared him for the human weight of victory. He thought of the letter he had written to his mother before the invasion began and felt a sudden, sharp wish that he could add something to it, something honest about what these first victories actually looked like up close. In the field, Sergei listened to the breathing of the men around him and tried to quiet his own mind. The shame of surrender still burned, but it was slowly being joined by something else, a stubborn determination to survive long enough to see his family again. He thought of Anna in her village, though he did not know her name, only that somewhere there were mothers and children waiting just as his own were waiting. The small acts of the day, the shared bread, the canteen of water, the steadying hand, had shown him that even here, in the middle of defeat, the impulse to care for one another had not died completely. He closed his eyes and let the exhaustion pull him under, knowing that tomorrow the march would begin again and that he would need whatever strength he could gather in these few hours of darkness. The next day brought the same dust and the same heat, but something had shifted in the column. Men who had walked alone the day before now moved in small groups, helping each other over rough patches, sharing whatever scraps of food or information they had. The tall farmer had found a piece of cloth and torn it into strips to bind a wound on Pavel's foot. Sergei carried the boy's pack for a while when the weight seemed too much. These were not grand gestures. They were the quiet rebellions of people who refused to let the circumstances strip away their humanity entirely. The guards watched but did not interfere much. Some even looked relieved when the prisoners moved more steadily, as if the long column was easier to manage when it moved as one weary organism rather than thousands of separate broken men. Carl rode alongside again that second day. He passed the canteen once more, this time to a different man who had fallen behind. The prisoner took it without meeting his eyes, drank, and handed it back with a small nod. Carl nodded in return and continued on. In that brief exchange there was no victory or defeat, only two tired men recognizing something familiar in each other. Later, when the column stopped for a short rest, Carl watched Sergei help Pavel to his feet again and felt the same strange twist in his chest he had felt watching the refugees on the first day. These were not the faceless enemy he had been prepared to face. They were men carrying the same private fears and small hopes that he carried. As the days of the march stretched on, the landscape changed from the familiar fields of the border regions to flatter, more open country. The prisoners grew thinner, their faces sharper, their eyes more guarded. Yet the small kindnesses continued. A man who had once been a teacher shared stories from books he had loved, giving the others something to think about besides the ache in their legs and the emptiness in their stomachs. Another, who had been a carpenter, used a sharp stone to carve small wooden figures for the younger prisoners, tiny animals that fit in a palm and could be held during the long hours of walking. Sergei received one, a simple bird, and carried it in his pocket, running his thumb over the rough wings when the doubts grew too loud. These acts did not change the reality of the captivity, but they changed the way the men carried it. They reminded each other, without words, that they were still capable of creating something gentle in the middle of hardness. Carl continued to watch the column from his motorcycle. He had begun to recognize certain faces, Sergei's quiet determination, Pavel's young exhaustion, the tall farmer's steady presence. He did not speak to them beyond the occasional canteen or shouted order when the line strayed. But he found himself hoping, in a way he could not explain to his comrades, that these particular men would reach whatever destination waited for them. The victory that had seemed so clear in the first hours of the invasion was revealing itself to be something more complicated, something that carried its own costs on both sides of the wire. One evening, after the column had been herded into another makeshift field for the night, Sergei sat with Pavel and the tall farmer and listened to the low conversations around them. A man a few paces away was describing the last letter he had received from his wife before the invasion. He spoke of the way she had written about the garden coming in and the children asking when their father would be home. The words hung in the cooling air like something precious and fragile. Sergei thought of his own mother's letter and finally unfolded it in the fading light. He read the familiar lines once more, the simple wishes for his safety and the news of the village. When he finished, he folded it carefully and returned it to his pocket. The letter had become more than paper. It was proof that somewhere the ordinary world still existed, waiting. The march continued through heat and occasional rain, through days that blurred into one another and nights that offered little rest. The men learned to read the guards' moods, to move when ordered and to rest when allowed. They learned which of their own could be trusted with a shared secret or a hidden piece of food. They learned that survival was not only about the body but about the mind's ability to hold on to small reasons to keep putting one foot in front of the other. Sergei kept counting the bends in the road. Pavel kept walking despite the pain in his foot. The tall farmer kept offering his strength to anyone who needed it. And somewhere in the column, other men did the same, quiet acts of everyday heroism that no history book would record but that kept the human spirit from breaking completely under the weight of defeat. These early pockets and the long marches that followed them were the first great tests of what this war would demand from ordinary people. The rapid advances had created situations where entire formations were cut off before they could react, before the reality of the new front could be understood. Men who had expected to defend their homes found themselves walking away from them in columns that stretched for kilometers. The shame of surrender sat alongside the relief of still being alive. The fear of what captivity would bring mixed with the stubborn refusal to let go of dignity. And in the spaces between the suffering, the small kindnesses, between prisoners, and sometimes even between prisoner and guard, revealed that the war had not yet succeeded in stripping away everything that made these men human. If the quiet endurance of these men on the long road into captivity has moved you, the way they held on to dignity through dust and thirst, the way they shared bread and stories and small carved birds when everything else had been taken, then I want to offer you a way to keep their memory alive. The hours of research and careful gathering of these forgotten personal stories take real dedication, and if you feel called to support that work, even a small tip on Ko-Fi, as little as $1, helps ensure that these human truths continue to reach people who need to hear them. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the column finally neared its destination after days that felt like weeks, Sergei looked back along the line of men behind him. They were thinner, dirtier, more silent than the group that had begun this march. Yet they were still walking. Pavel was still on his feet. The tall farmer still offered his arm to anyone who needed it. And somewhere ahead, whatever waited for them would have to reckon with the fact that these were not broken men. They were men who had already begun to carry their captivity the only way they knew how, by protecting the small pieces of humanity they still possessed and by refusing to let the dust of the road erase who they had been before the sky rained fire and the world changed forever. In the frozen half-light of a Leningrad apartment, a mother named Elena counted the last grains of flour on her kitchen table as if each one were a promise she might still keep to her daughter. The city had been cut off for weeks now, the last road closed by the advancing forces, yet life inside the siege lines continued in its strange, stubborn rhythm. Elena lived on the third floor of a building that still had most of its windows, though the glass in the stairwell had been replaced with cardboard and old newspapers. Her daughter, 12-year-old Anya, sat on the floor near the stove that no longer gave heat, wrapped in every coat and blanket they owned. Elena had stopped telling her that things would get better soon. Instead, she measured out the day's ration with careful fingers and tried to make the thin soup last through both their spoons. Outside, the sky was the color of old iron. Somewhere in the distance, the low crump of artillery reminded everyone that the ring around the city was tightening, but inside the apartment the only immediate enemy was the cold and the empty cupboard. Elena had worked in a textile factory before the encirclement. Now the factory ran on whatever fuel and workers could still reach it, producing uniforms and bandages for the soldiers holding the perimeter. She walked there each morning when she had the strength, her feet wrapped in layers of cloth because real boots had become impossible to find. On the way she passed queues already forming outside bakeries that might or might not open. People stood without speaking much, their faces turned inward, conserving whatever warmth and hope they still carried. Sometimes a neighbor would nod or share a word about a son at the front or a husband who had not come home from the night shift. These small exchanges were the threads that kept the city from unraveling completely. In another part of Leningrad, a composer named Dmitri sat at a piano in a freezing rehearsal hall. The orchestra had been ordered to continue its work. The leaders believed that music itself could be a weapon against the despair that threatened to finish what the artillery had begun. Dmitri's hands were stiff from the cold. He wore gloves with the fingers cut off so he could still touch the keys. Around him, the musicians tuned their instruments with the same quiet concentration they had always shown, though many of them were already living on the same shrinking rations as everyone else. They had performed through air raids before. They had played while the city learned what it meant to be surrounded. Tonight they were rehearsing a new symphony, one written in the middle of the siege itself. Dmitri paused between movements and looked at the faces around him. Some were gaunt. Some had the faraway look of people who had already lost too much. Yet they kept their instruments ready. The music was not a denial of what was happening outside. It was a refusal to let the siege have the final word on who they were. Elena returned from the factory that afternoon with a small bundle of bread and a handful of dry peas someone had shared from their own meager store. She and Anya ate slowly, making each bite last. Afterward, Elena sat by the window and watched the street below. A group of children was playing a game with sticks and a rag ball, their voices thin in the cold air. Their mothers stood nearby, arms crossed against the wind, eyes never leaving the children for long. Elena thought of her own childhood in a village farther south, before the city had become her home. She had come here for work and for the life the city promised. Now that life was reduced to counting grains and keeping the stove from going completely cold. Yet the children still played. The mothers still watched. Somewhere an orchestra still rehearsed. These were the things that told her the city had not surrendered, even if no one had asked her opinion. The siege had begun with the sudden realization that the last road out was gone. For days people had hoped the ring would be broken quickly. Trains had still run in the early weeks, carrying some children and elderly to safety before the ice closed the possibilities. Elena had considered sending Anya on one of those trains, but the girl had refused, clinging to her mother with a fierceness that had surprised them both. Now they were together in the shrinking circle of their days. Elena wrote letters she could not send, filling pages with descriptions of the weather and small reassurances, as if the act of writing itself could keep the connection to the world outside alive. She kept the letters in a drawer, adding to the stack each week. Sometimes she read the older ones aloud to Anya, turning them into stories of a time when bread had been ordinary and the streets had not echoed with distant shelling. Dmitri's orchestra gave its first performance of the new symphony in a hall that still had some of its chandeliers, though most of the seats were empty. The musicians played with a concentration that bordered on defiance. The music filled the cold space and seemed to push back against the weight of the city's hunger and fear. People who could still walk came to listen. Some arrived with blankets wrapped around their shoulders. Others brought whatever they could spare from their rations to share afterward. The performance did not end the siege. It did not fill the bakeries or stop the artillery. But it reminded everyone who heard it that they were still capable of creating something beautiful even while the world tried to reduce them to survival alone. Dmitri stood afterward with his colleagues, their breath visible in the unheated hall. They spoke little. The music had said what needed saying. Winter arrived with a cruelty that turned the city into a landscape of ice and silence. The Neva froze solid. The streets became paths of packed snow. Elena and Anya moved through their days with the slow carefulness of people who knew that a fall could mean a broken bone they could not afford to treat. The rations grew smaller. Elena learned to stretch a single piece of bread across 2 meals by toasting it slowly over the last embers in the stove. She and Anya took turns wearing the warmest coat when they had to go outside. At night they slept together under every blanket they owned, sharing body heat the way animals do in the wild. Elena thought often of the letters in the drawer. She imagined the people who might read them one day, if the city survived, and she tried to write them in a way that would not frighten whoever found them. She wrote about the way the light looked on the frozen river at dawn. She wrote about Anya's growing skill at mending clothes with thread pulled from old garments. She did not write about the hunger that had begun to hollow out their faces or the way sleep had become a dangerous luxury because waking up felt harder each morning. In the orchestra, musicians continued to gather when they could. Some had died. Others were too weak to leave their apartments. Those who remained played with instruments that had grown cold to the touch. Dmitri composed new pieces in the margins of old scores, using whatever paper he could find. The music became shorter, more concentrated, as if every note had to carry the weight of what could no longer be said in words. One evening after a rehearsal, a violinist shared a small piece of chocolate he had been saving from before the encirclement. The musicians divided it into slivers so thin they almost disappeared on the tongue. They ate in silence, the sweetness startling after weeks of bland rations. That night Dmitri walked home through streets lit only by the occasional glow from a window where someone still had a candle. He thought of the symphony they had performed and of the faces in the audience. He thought of how many of those faces might not be there for the next performance. Yet the music continued because stopping would have meant something worse than hunger or cold. It would have meant letting the siege win the argument about what the city was for. Elena's factory kept running on whatever shifts could be filled. She worked beside women who had once been strangers and had become something closer to sisters through shared exhaustion. They spoke of their children, of the small miracles of finding an extra potato or a piece of soap. One woman had a husband at the front and received letters through the precarious supply routes that still reached the city by air or across the ice when it was thick enough. She read parts of them aloud during breaks, her voice steady even when the words were not. Elena listened and thought of her own unsent letters. She wondered if somewhere her own words were being carried toward people who needed to know that Leningrad was still breathing, still refusing to disappear. The long winter taught everyone inside the siege what endurance actually looked like. It was not dramatic stands or grand gestures. It was Elena measuring flour grain by grain. It was Dmitri's fingers finding the keys despite the gloves. It was neighbors sharing a match or a story or a moment of silence when words ran out. It was children still playing in courtyards cleared of snow, their laughter thin but real. The city did not surrender because the people inside it had decided, each in their own small way, that surrender was not an option they were willing to consider. They continued to work, to create, to care for one another because those acts were the only weapons they had left against the cold and the hunger and the isolation. As the ice on Lake Ladoga grew thick enough to bear trucks, a narrow lifeline opened. Supplies began to move across the frozen surface in convoys that drivers risked their lives to complete. Elena heard about the road of life from neighbors who had stood in line for the first deliveries. She did not join the queues herself at first. She stayed in the apartment with Anya, teaching her daughter how to read from the few books they still had and how to write letters of her own that might one day be sent. When the first real bread arrived in their district, Elena carried her share home with the same carefulness she had once carried Anya as a baby. They ate it slowly, letting the taste fill their mouths completely before swallowing. That night Elena added a new page to her stack of letters. She wrote about the bread and about the way Anya had smiled for the first time in weeks. She did not mention the cost of that bread and lives lost on the ice road. She wrote only what she wanted remembered. Dimitri's orchestra performed again when the hall could be heated enough for the instruments to stay in tune. The audience was smaller than before, but those who came listened with an intensity that made every note feel necessary. After the performance, people lingered in the cold foyer, reluctant to return to apartments where the only warmth came from shared bodies and thin blankets. Dimitri spoke with a young soldier who had been given leave to attend. The soldier described the perimeter defenses and the way the men there spoke of the city as something worth holding at any price. Dimitri listened and later wrote a short piece for solo violin that tried to capture the sound of that conversation, the steadiness in the soldier's voice, the weight of what he had seen, the quiet determination that had nothing to do with heroics and everything to do with refusing to let go. Spring came slowly, the ice on the river breaking into jagged pieces that drifted toward the sea. The city was still surrounded, still hungry, still under threat from the air and from the guns. Yet something had changed in the way people moved through their days. The worst of the winter had passed. The road of life had proven that the city could be reached. Elena and Anya walked together to the factory one morning, the girl carrying a small bundle of mended clothes her mother would trade for extra rations. They passed a group of musicians carrying instruments toward a rehearsal. Dimitri walked among them, his coat collar turned up against the wind. He nodded to Elena as they passed, two strangers recognizing in each other the same stubborn refusal to disappear. Neither spoke. There was no need. The city itself was speaking through every person who still chose to keep going. The siege would last for hundreds more days. The hunger would return in new waves. The artillery would keep its rhythm. But the people inside Leningrad had already decided what the outcome would be. They would not surrender. They would endure by continuing to do the ordinary things that made them human, measuring flour, playing music, writing letters, sharing bread, watching children play. These acts did not end the war. They did not lift the encirclement. They simply refused to let the war have the last word on what a city and its people were worth. Elena kept adding to her stack of letters. Dimitri kept composing. The orchestra kept rehearsing. And somewhere in the middle of all that quiet defiance, the city remained itself, wounded, hungry, cold, and still unbowed. If the stories of these ordinary people who refused to let hunger or cold or isolation erase their humanity have stayed with you, the mother counting grains of flour, the composer whose fingers found music even in freezing rooms, the neighbors who shared what little they had, then I want to invite you deeper into this world of forgotten endurance. For those of you who want to explore the full, unfiltered reality behind these sieges and the people who lived them, our Patreon community offers exclusive and censored video sections, in-depth podcasts that go further into the personal accounts, raw footage that never makes it to public platforms, and a place to connect with others who share your fascination with the real human cost of history. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Elena stood at her window one evening as the light faded and watched the city settle into another night of endurance. Anya slept on the bed behind her, breathing steadily for the first time in many days. Elena took out the newest letter she had written and read it once more before adding it to the drawer. The words were simple. They spoke of bread and music and children still playing in the courtyards. They spoke of a city that had chosen to remain standing even when everything around it tried to pull it down. She closed the drawer and turned back to the window. Outside, the streets were quiet. Somewhere an orchestra was rehearsing again. Somewhere a mother was measuring the last of her flour. And somewhere in the middle of it all, the decision to keep going had already been made, one small act of ordinary courage at a time. That decision, repeated across thousands of apartments and rehearsal halls and factory floors, was what the siege could never take away. The first snow fell softly on the German columns as they pushed toward Moscow, but within days that gentle white had become a silent, merciless enemy that turned engines to ice and men into shadows of themselves. Carl stood beside his vehicle in the gray light of an early winter morning, his breath forming clouds that froze on his scarf before he could draw another. The road ahead had disappeared under a blanket that grew deeper with every hour. His unit had been ordered to keep moving, to reach the capital before the weather could finish what the Soviet defenses had begun. But the weather was winning. Tracks on the half-tracks had frozen solid overnight. Fuel lines had cracked. Men who had marched confidently through summer fields now huddled around fires that gave more smoke than heat, their faces raw from wind that cut like glass. Carl flexed his fingers inside gloves that no longer kept the cold out. He thought of the letter he had written before the invasion, the one about birch trees glowing in evening light. That world felt like a story someone else had told him long ago. He had seen the first signs of trouble weeks earlier, when the endless roads began to turn to mud and then to something harder and more unforgiving. The briefings had promised a quick campaign. The maps had shown Moscow as a prize almost within reach. What the maps had not shown was how the land itself would fight back once the temperature dropped and the snow refused to stop falling. Carl watched a comrade try to start a motorcycle. The engine coughed once and died. The man swore and kicked the frozen ground, then sat down heavily on the seat as if the effort had used the last of his strength. Carl walked over without speaking and offered the canteen he still carried from those first days of the advance. The water inside was half ice. They shared it anyway, passing it between them like a ritual that no longer held any warmth. In Moscow, a young woman named Irina stood on a rooftop with a group of civilians who had been given shovels and instructions to clear snow from the anti-aircraft positions. She was 20, a student before the war who had never imagined herself standing on frozen tiles with a rifle leaning against the parapet. The city had called for every able hand to prepare for what everyone now knew was coming. Barricades of sandbags and overturned trams blocked the main avenues. Factory workers who had once made textiles or machines now turned out tank traps and fortified positions in the suburbs. Irina's hands were blistered from the shovel work, but she kept moving because stopping felt like surrender. Below her, the streets were quieter than they had been in summer. Many families had sent children east on the trains that still ran. Those who remained moved with the same careful economy Elena had learned in Leningrad, conserving warmth, conserving words, conserving hope. Irina thought often of her older brother, who had been at the front since the first weeks. She had received one letter from him, written in pencil on paper that smelled faintly of smoke. He had written about the vastness of the country and how the enemy seemed to appear from every direction at once. He had not written about fear. Irina read between the lines anyway. She kept the letter in the pocket of her coat, close to her heart, and touched it sometimes when the cold made her doubt whether Moscow could really hold. The city was not just buildings and streets to her. It was the place where she had learned to read, where she had first heard music in a concert hall, where her family had gathered around a table that no longer existed in the same way. Defending it had become a private promise she made each morning when she woke to another layer of frost on the window. Carl's unit received orders to press on despite the weather. They abandoned vehicles that could no longer move and continued on foot, carrying what they could. The snow swallowed sound. Men spoke less because talking used energy they needed to keep their blood moving. Carl found himself thinking of home in longer stretches now. He remembered the way his mother's kitchen smelled on winter mornings, the steam from soup rising into the cold air of the room. He remembered church bells on Sunday and the way the fields looked after the first hard frost. Those memories had once given him strength. Now they made the present sharper by contrast. He had seen men simply stop walking in the last days, sitting down in the snow as if the effort of another step was beyond them. Some had been helped up by comrades. Others had been left where they sat because stopping for too long meant joining them. The Soviet defenders felt the same cold, but they felt it on ground they knew and were willing to die to keep. Irina spent one night in a trench on the outskirts with a mixed group of soldiers and civilians. The ground was frozen so hard that digging had been impossible without explosives and picks. They had piled snow into low walls and taken turns watching the darkness. A young soldier beside her had shared a piece of hard bread he had been saving. They ate it slowly, letting it soften in their mouths before swallowing. He told her his name was Pavel and that he had come from a village near the border. Irina did not tell him she had once lived in a similar village before her family moved to the city. She simply listened and passed the bread back when he offered it again. In the silence between them, the shared food became something larger than hunger. It became proof that they were still capable of generosity even when everything else had been stripped away. Carl reached a forward position on a day when the temperature had dropped so low that exposed skin froze in minutes. His unit was told to hold a line of woods overlooking a road that led toward the city. The trees offered some shelter from the wind, but none from the knowledge that they were closer to Moscow than any German force had ever been and still not close enough. Carl sat with his back against a trunk and tried to write a new letter home. The pencil moved slowly across the paper. He wrote about the snow and about how the men around him were still trying to joke even when their feet had gone numb. He did not write about the doubt that had begun to settle in his chest like the ice in his canteen. He folded the letter and tucked it inside his tunic, where it would stay until he could find a way to send it or until he no longer needed to. In Moscow, the call went out for every remaining citizen who could hold a weapon to report for the defense. Irina reported with the others from her rooftop crew. They were given rifles that had been repaired in factory workshops and told to hold the inner ring of barricades if the outer defenses broke. She stood in a line with women and older men and boys who looked too young to be there. The instructor who trained them spoke plainly. He did not promise victory. He spoke of the city as something that belonged to all of them and of what it would mean if it fell. Irina listened and felt the weight of the rifle in her hands become something she could carry. That night she wrote a short note to her brother, not knowing if it would ever reach him. She told him she was staying and that she understood now why he had written so little about fear. Fear was there, but it had been pushed aside by something stronger, the simple refusal to let the city disappear while she still had strength to stand. The German advance slowed to a crawl and then to something close to a halt. Carl's unit received contradictory orders: advance, hold, prepare for counterattack. The snow kept falling. Men who had once moved in disciplined formations now moved in small clusters, each person conserving whatever warmth they could find in the body next to them. Carl saw the same guard who had shared his canteen with prisoners in the early pockets now sharing his own coat with a younger soldier whose own had been lost. The small kindnesses had not stopped. They had simply changed shape under the pressure of the cold. Carl thought of the prisoners he had watched marching and wondered whether any of them were still alive in whatever camps waited for them. He wondered whether the men he guarded now would one day remember the small mercies the way he remembered the ones he had witnessed. Irina's group was moved to a position closer to the center of the city as the outer defenses held longer than anyone had expected. The barricades they had helped build were now manned by a mix of regular troops and people like her, factory workers, students, mothers who had sent their children away and stayed to fight. One evening a small group of them gathered in a basement that still had a working stove. They shared what food they had and spoke of the city they were defending. An older man described the Moscow he had known before the war, the theaters, the parks, the way the river looked in summer. A young woman talked about the factory where she had worked and how the machines were still running because someone had to keep producing what the defenders needed. Irina listened and added her own memory of hearing music in a hall that now stood dark. These conversations did not change the temperature outside or the threat still pressing from the west. They changed the way the cold felt inside each person who participated. The city was not just a place to defend. It was a collection of memories and daily habits and small beauties that no army could carry away in a single advance. Carl received word that his unit was being pulled back to a more defensible line. The order came with no explanation, only the quiet understanding that the push toward Moscow had reached its limit. He packed what little he still carried and looked back toward the city he had never entered. The snow-covered fields between his position and the distant spires seemed to stretch forever. He thought of the birch trees he had written about in that first letter and of how little the maps had prepared any of them for what the land would actually demand. He touched the letter still inside his tunic and wondered whether he would ever add to it or whether this would be the last page he wrote from this war. In Moscow, the defenders held their positions through another night of wind and darkness. Irina stood watch with Pavel, the young soldier she had met in the trench. They spoke little, but the silence between them had become companionable. When the first light of dawn touched the snow, they saw that the German lines had not advanced overnight. The city was still theirs. Irina touched the letter in her pocket and allowed herself a small, private moment of something close to relief. She did not know that the frost had already done what artillery and tanks had not been able to accomplish. She only knew that she was still standing and that the city behind her was still breathing. The winter had exposed something that no briefing could have prepared either side to face. For the advancing forces, it revealed the limits of speed and confidence when the land itself rose up in resistance. For the defenders, it revealed the depth of what people would endure when the alternative was losing the place they called home. Carl's unit continued its withdrawal, each step now carrying them away from the prize they had been promised. Irina and the others like her remained at their posts, the cold still biting but no longer the only enemy they faced. Between them lay the snow-covered ground that had turned a rapid campaign into something far slower and far more costly than anyone had imagined when the first flakes began to fall. If these personal stories of endurance in the face of a winter that no map could predict, the German soldier watching his comrades freeze, the young woman in Moscow choosing to stay and defend what she loved, have left you wanting to understand the hidden layers behind such turning points, then I have something valuable to share with you. For those who want to go deeper into the forgotten operations and secret battles that shaped the course of the war, our free email newsletter delivers the powerful ebook The Shadow War, 5 top secret operations that shaped World War II, along with weekly deep dives into espionage, forgotten heroes, and the hidden stories that changed everything. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the snow continued to fall across the fields outside Moscow, Carl added one more line to the letter he carried. He wrote that the cold had taught him things no training could have shown. In the city, Irina read her brother's letter once more by the light of a single candle and then folded it carefully back into her pocket. Neither of them knew how the war would continue or what the next winter would demand. They only knew that they had reached a place where the ordinary acts of staying alive and staying human had become the most extraordinary resistance of all. The frost had stopped an army. It had also revealed, in the quiet endurance of those who faced it, what the defense of home could still demand from the human heart when everything else had been stripped away. The river called to them across hundreds of kilometers of steppe, its name spoken in orders and in quiet conversations around dying fires, until the Volga became more than water. It became the place where everything that had come before would finally be settled. Carl felt the pull long before he saw the first glint of the river. His unit had turned south after the winter outside Moscow had frozen their advance in place. The orders had arrived with the same certainty that had carried them across the border in the first days of the invasion, but something in the tone had changed. There was urgency now, and something closer to obsession. The city on the Volga was no longer just another objective on a map. It had become a symbol that leaders on both sides seemed willing to feed men into without limit. Carl walked with his rifle slung and his thoughts turning over the same questions he had carried since the first snow fell. Why this city? Why now, when the land had already shown what it could do to armies that moved too far too fast? The march south was different from the early advance. The roads were longer, the supply columns thinner, the heat of late summer pressing down like a hand on the back of every man's neck. Karl's comrades spoke less than they had in the beginning. Some still believed the campaign would end quickly once they reached the river. Others had begun to measure distance in days of thirst rather than kilometers gained. Karl found himself among the second group. He had seen too many vehicles abandoned beside the road, too many men sitting with their heads in their hands because their boots had worn through and there was nothing left to replace them. He carried a new letter inside his tunic, one he had started writing after Moscow and had added to in fragments whenever the column stopped long enough for him to find a moment of shade. In it he described the endless sky and the way the dust rose in clouds that turned men into ghosts. He did not write about the growing sense that the war was no longer moving according to any plan he could recognize. In a village the column passed through, a young Soviet soldier named Victor stood with his unit watching the dust on the horizon. He had been ordered to fall back toward the Volga, toward the city his leaders had decided must be held at any cost. Victor was 23, a tractor driver from a collective farm farther east before the war had pulled him into uniform. He had a wife and a small son in a village that had already been touched by the fighting. The last letter from his wife had arrived weeks earlier, carried by a courier who had risked the roads to bring news from home. She had written about the harvest that might never be gathered and about their son asking when his father would return. Victor had read the letter until the creases were soft, then folded it carefully and kept it with the few other things he still carried. Now, as the German dust grew closer, he thought of that letter and of the river that lay ahead. The Volga had always been part of the stories his grandmother told, wide and patient, a place where people had lived for generations. He had never imagined he would be asked to defend it with a rifle in his hands. Karl's unit reached a railhead where supplies were supposed to be waiting. The trains had been delayed or diverted. Men waited in the heat, sharing what little water they had and speaking in low voices about the city that waited at the end of the road. One older soldier, a veteran of earlier campaigns, told a story about a river crossing in another war, how the water had seemed to fight back as much as the enemy. Karl listened without speaking. He thought of the canteen he still carried from the early days and of the prisoners he had watched marching in the opposite direction. He wondered whether any of those men had families waiting beside their own rivers. The thought stayed with him as the column moved again, the dust rising once more around boots that had already carried them farther than any of them had expected to go. Victor's unit dug in on a low ridge overlooking a stretch of open ground the Germans would have to cross. The work was hard in the heat. The ground was baked hard, and the shovels bit shallow. Victor worked beside a man from his village who had joined at the same time. They spoke of home between swings of the shovel, about the fields they had worked together, about the way the river looked when the ice broke in spring. The conversation was ordinary, the kind men have when they need to remember that life existed before orders and dust and the distant rumble of engines. When the position was as ready as they could make it, they sat in the shallow trench and shared a piece of hard bread. Victor took out his wife's letter and read it once more, though he already knew every word. The man beside him did not ask what it said. He simply nodded when Victor folded it away again, as if the act of reading had been enough to steady them both. Karl's column reached the outskirts of the fighting that had already begun around the approaches to the city. The sound of artillery was different here, closer, more insistent. The air smelled of cordite and dust and something else that Karl could not name but recognized as the beginning of something larger. His unit was ordered to support an attack on a fortified position that blocked one of the main roads. They moved forward in the late afternoon heat, the sun still high enough to turn every shadow into a blade of darkness. Karl kept his eyes on the back of the man in front of him, the way he had learned to do on long marches. He thought of the letter inside his tunic and of the words he had not yet written, about how the pull toward this river felt different from anything that had come before, how it seemed to draw men forward even when their bodies had already begun to resist. The position fell after hours of fighting that left more men on the ground than either side had expected. Carl helped carry a wounded comrade back to a collection point where medics worked with what little they had. The wounded man was young, barely out of training when the campaign began. He kept asking for water even though there was none to spare. Carl stayed with him until the medics took over, then walked back toward his unit with the image of the boy's face still clear in his mind. That night, around a fire that gave more light than heat, Carl took out his letter and added a line about the boy who had wanted water more than anything else. He did not know if the letter would ever reach his mother. He wrote anyway because the act of putting words on paper was one of the few things that still felt like his own. Victor's unit was ordered to counterattack a German penetration that had reached a village on the near side of the Volga. They moved at night to avoid the worst of the heat and the enemy aircraft that had begun to appear more regularly. Victor carried his rifle and the memory of his wife's letter. The village was already burning when they arrived. Families were trying to save what they could, loading carts with whatever fit while shells landed in the fields around them. Victor and his comrades helped where they could, carrying an old woman to safety, steadying a cart that had lost a wheel. These were not the actions of soldiers in a grand battle. They were the small, necessary things men did when the war came to the places where ordinary people lived. Victor thought of his own village and of his son asking when he would come home. He wondered whether someone would help his family if the fighting reached them the way it had reached this place. Carl watched the same village burn from a distance. His unit had been pulled back after the counterattack to regroup. He saw the figures moving among the flames and the smoke, civilians and soldiers mixed together in the chaos, and felt the same twist in his chest he had felt watching the woman fall in the field on the first day. The war had become something that touched everyone in its path, not just the men with rifles. He thought of the letter he was still carrying and of the words he had written about birch trees and home. Those words felt further away with every kilometer they drew closer to the Volga. The river was no longer a line on a map. It was a current that had begun to pull whole armies toward a confrontation that no one seemed able to stop. In the days that followed, both sides fed more men and machines into the narrowing space between the steppe and the river. Carl's unit received replacements who had never seen the endless roads or the way the dust could swallow a column whole. Victor's unit was reinforced by men who had retreated from positions farther west and carried the same tired determination he had seen in his own comrades. The two forces circled each other like fighters testing for weakness, each side convinced that the next push would decide something larger than the ground they stood on. Carl wrote another line in his letter about the replacements and about how young they looked compared to the men who had started the campaign with him. He did not write about the growing certainty that this city on the Volga would demand more than any of them had been prepared to give. Victor received word that his village had been touched by the fighting. The news came through a courier who had known his family. Victor read the message in the quiet of a shallow trench and felt the weight of it settle beside the letter from his wife. He did not speak of it to the men around him. Instead, he cleaned his rifle with the same careful attention he had once given to the tractor on the collective farm. The ordinary act of maintenance became a way to hold onto something steady when everything else was shifting toward the river. He thought of his son and of the stories his grandmother had told about the Volga, how it had always been there, patient and wide, long before armies had come to fight over its banks. He wondered whether the river would still be there when this was over, or whether the fighting would change even the water itself. Carl's unit was ordered forward again as part of a larger push toward the northern approaches to the city. The ground was flatter here, the horizon broken only by the occasional rise and by the distant gleam of the river when the light caught it right. Carl saw the Volga for the first time from a low ridge. It was wider than he had imagined, a slow-moving ribbon that seemed to stretch forever in both directions. He stood for a moment with the other men in his section, none of them speaking. The sight of the river did something to the air around them. It made the campaign feel both closer to its end and somehow more dangerous, as if the water itself had been waiting for them all along. Carl touched the letter inside his tunic and thought of the words he still needed to add, about how the river had looked in the late light and about how the men around him had grown quiet at the sight of it. The obsession that had drawn them here was no longer only in the orders or the maps. It had become something the men carried in their own chests, the sense that this place, this river, this city, had become the measure of everything that had come before. For Carl, it was the place where the easy victories of summer had finally met something that would not yield. For Victor, it was the place where the defense of home had narrowed to a single stretch of water and the ground on either side. Both men wrote letters that night, Carl adding to the pages he still hoped would reach his mother, Victor writing a short note to his wife that he gave to a courier who promised to try to get it through. Neither knew whether the words would ever arrive. They wrote anyway because the act of reaching toward home was one of the few things that still felt like their own in a war that had begun to belong to the river. If the personal stories of men drawn toward the Volga, the German soldier watching the river appear on the horizon and feeling the weight of everything that had brought him there, the Soviet defender holding a letter from home while the city ahead became the last line, have stirred in you the same sense of honor for their courage that I feel, then I want to share a way to keep that connection alive. Many listeners tell me they want something tangible to remember these sacrifices by, something that lets them hold a piece of that history or experience the same spirit of endurance in another theater of the war. That is why I recommend exploring authentic World War II memorabilia that connects us directly to the men and women who lived these moments, or settling in to watch the powerful film Midway on Prime Video, which captures the same human drama and the global fight against tyranny that defined the Eastern Front as well. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the light faded over the Volga, Carl folded his letter one more time and placed it back inside his tunic. Victor did the same with the note he had written. Around both men, the armies continued their slow, inevitable movement toward the city that had become more than a name on a map. The river flowed on, patient and wide, carrying the weight of every choice that had led to this moment. Neither side yet knew how long the fighting would last or how many more letters would be written and never sent. They only knew that they had reached the place the orders and the maps and their own private hopes had been drawing them toward all along. And in that knowledge, the war had already begun to change into something neither maps nor orders could fully contain. The city had become a maze of broken stone and fire where men no longer fought for ground but for the next breath and the next corner. Carl moved through the ruins with the careful steps of someone who had learned that every shadow could hold a rifle. The buildings that had once lined the streets were now jagged skeletons, their walls pockmarked by shellfire and their windows empty like the eyes of the dead. His unit had been ordered into the northern factory district, where the fighting had already turned the massive workshops into fortresses of rubble and twisted metal. Carl carried his rifle low, his eyes scanning the piles of brick and the dark doorways. The air smelled of dust and cordite and something sweeter that he tried not to name. He had seen men fall in open fields before, but this was different. Here the enemy could be in the room beside you or above your head, and the only warning was the sudden crack of a rifle or the rattle of machine gun fire echoing off the walls. He thought of the letter still inside his tunic, the one he had been adding to since the march toward the Volga. There had been no time to write since they entered the city. The days had blurred into a series of short, violent bursts, clear a building, hold the position, fall back when the counterattack came. Carl had learned to sleep in short stretches, his back against whatever wall still stood, his dreams filled with the sound of boots on broken glass. He had stopped trying to picture the birch trees from that first letter. Now his mind returned instead to the faces of the men who had started this campaign with him and were no longer there. Some had fallen in the open steppe. Others had simply disappeared into the maze of streets and never come back. In another part of the same district, Victor crouched behind a low wall of sandbags and rubble inside what had once been a tractor factory. The vast hall was now a landscape of overturned machinery and collapsed girders. His unit had been ordered to hold this section at all costs. Victor had grown used to the constant noise, the distant rumble of artillery, the closer crack of rifles, the occasional shout or scream that cut through everything else. He kept his wife's letter in a pocket close to his chest, the paper now soft from being folded and unfolded so many times. He did not read it often anymore. He knew the words by heart. Instead, he touched the pocket sometimes when the fear rose too high, as if the paper itself could steady his hands on the rifle. Victor had seen the city change in the weeks since the fighting reached its edges. The streets that had once carried ordinary traffic were now blocked by burned-out vehicles and piles of rubble. Families who had not been able to leave huddled in cellars or the deeper parts of buildings, emerging only when the firing paused. Victor and his comrades had helped move an old couple from one shattered apartment to another safer corner, carrying their few belongings in a single bundle. The old man had pressed a piece of bread into Victor's hand afterward, a small, stubborn act of thanks that had stayed with him longer than the fighting that followed. These moments did not end the battle. They simply reminded everyone involved that the city still contained lives that had nothing to do with orders or maps. Carl's section was ordered to clear a 4-story apartment block that overlooked a key intersection. They moved in through the ground floor, stepping over furniture that had been overturned and left behind. The air inside was thick with dust and the smell of old cooking fires. Carl climbed the stairs slowly, listening for any sound above the pounding of his own heart. On the second floor, they found 2 Soviet soldiers who had been holding the landing. The fight was short and brutal, the kind that left no room for thought or hesitation. When it was over, Carl sat on the stairs with his back against the wall, his hands shaking in a way they had not shaken after fights in the open. One of his comrades passed him a canteen. The water was warm and tasted of metal, but Carl drank it anyway because his throat had gone dry. The small act of sharing was the only kindness the moment allowed. Victor heard the fighting in the apartment block through the walls of the factory. His unit had been ordered to counterattack if the Germans gained a foothold. He waited with the others in the shadows of the great hall, listening to the echoes that carried across the distance. When the order came, they moved through the rubble-strewn streets in small groups, using the broken buildings for cover. Victor found himself beside a man he had known only by his first name, a quiet fellow from a village farther up the river. They did not speak as they advanced. There was nothing to say that the rifles and the grenades could not express more quickly. They reached the apartment block and fought their way up the same stairs Carl's section had used. The rooms were already contested ground, and the fighting turned into a series of short, vicious exchanges across doorways and through holes blasted in walls. Carl was in one of those rooms when Victor's group entered. The 2 men never saw each other directly. They fought through the same space at different moments, separated by minutes and by the chaos of the building. Carl had taken cover behind an overturned table when a grenade rolled across the floor. He kicked it back toward the doorway and pressed himself flat as the blast shook the walls. Dust and plaster rained down. In the ringing silence that followed, he heard someone calling for help from another room. He moved toward the sound without thinking, his training overriding the fear that had settled in his chest. He found a wounded comrade and dragged him toward the stairs, the weight of the man's body making every step an effort. Another soldier appeared and helped carry the burden the rest of the way down. They laid the wounded man in the relative safety of the ground floor, and Carl stayed with him for a few minutes, speaking quietly about nothing in particular because words seemed to help more than silence. Victor's group cleared the upper floors of the same building later that day. They found the signs of the earlier fight, the spent cartridges, the blood on the floor, the holes in the walls where grenades had exploded. Victor stood in one of the rooms and looked out through a shattered window at the street below. The city stretched away in every direction, a sea of ruins that seemed to have no end. He thought of his wife's letter and of the village he had left behind. The fighting here had stripped away any illusion that this was still a war of movement and grand plans. It had become something smaller and more terrible, a contest of endurance measured in single rooms and single hours. He touched the pocket with the letter and then turned back to his comrades, because there was still work to do before night fell. Night in the city was its own kind of terror. The firing never stopped completely, but it grew more sporadic, more personal. Men on both sides listened for the scrape of boots on rubble or the whisper of voices in adjacent buildings. Carl sat in the basement of the apartment block with the rest of his section, sharing what little food they had. The conversation was low and fragmented. Someone spoke of home. Another described a dream he had had the night before about walking through fields that were not on fire. Carl listened without adding much. He thought instead of the letter inside his tunic and of the words he had not yet written about what this kind of fighting did to a man. It was not the grand courage of stories. It was the stubborn refusal to let the next room or the next floor be taken without cost. Victor spent that same night in a corner of the tractor factory, his back against a piece of machinery that still smelled faintly of oil. The men around him slept in shifts, one always awake and listening. Victor took his turn and used the quiet to think about the old couple he had helped move earlier. He wondered whether they were still safe in whatever corner they had found. The thought of ordinary people caught in this maze of stone and fire had begun to weigh on him more heavily than the fear for his own life. He had joined the army to defend his country. Now the defense had narrowed to this single district, this single factory, this single night of listening for footsteps that did not belong. He touched the letter in his pocket once more and then settled back into the watch, because the city demanded that small, steady acts of attention even when sleep would have been easier. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of attack and counterattack, of clearing rooms and losing them again. Carl's section was rotated out of the apartment block and sent to another position near the factory district. The new building was a massive structure of steel and concrete that had been fought over so many times the original purpose was lost. They moved through it in small teams, using the catwalks and the heavy machinery for cover. Carl found himself paired with a younger soldier who had arrived with the most recent replacements. The boy was barely 18 and had the wide-eyed look of someone who had not yet learned to hide his fear. Carl showed him how to move through the rubble without making too much noise, how to check a room before entering, how to share the last of the water when the canteens ran dry. These were not lessons from any manual. They were the small kindnesses that kept men alive one more day in a place where survival had become the only victory that mattered. Victor's unit was ordered to retake part of the factory that Carl's section now held. The attack came at dawn, when the light was still thin and the shadows long. Victor moved with the others through the outer yards, using the wrecks of machines and the piles of scrap metal for cover. The fighting inside the building was close and brutal. Men fired through holes in walls and threw grenades around corners. Victor found himself in a long gallery lined with assembly lines that had been turned into barricades. He saw a German soldier across the space, their eyes meeting for a fraction of a second before both raised their rifles. The shot Victor fired went wide. The return fire caught the man beside him instead. Victor dragged the wounded comrade behind a piece of machinery and pressed a cloth against the bleeding while the rest of the unit pushed forward. The small act of stopping to help was the only thing he could do in the middle of the larger violence. Carl was in that same gallery when Victor's group attacked. He had been moving along one of the upper catwalks when the firing started below. He took cover behind a heavy press and returned fire when he could see a target. The boy he had been teaching was hit in the first exchange. Carl crawled to him and pulled him back toward the stairs, the same way he had carried the wounded man in the apartment block. The effort left him breathing hard and tasting blood in his mouth from the dust. He stayed with the boy until medics could reach them, speaking the same quiet words he had used before because they seemed to help more than silence. When the attack was beaten back, Carl sat on the catwalk with his back against the railing and looked down at the gallery. The fighting had left new scars on the already ruined space. He thought of the letter inside his tunic and of how many more pages he would need before this city was done with him. Victor's unit held the gallery for the rest of that day and into the night. He sat with the wounded man he had helped, sharing the last of his water and listening to the man talk about his family in a village Victor had never seen. The conversation was ordinary and broken, the kind that happens when pain and exhaustion strip away everything else. Victor thought of his own wife and son and of the letter that had become his only connection to them. He wondered whether they were still safe or whether the war had already reached their village the way it had reached this factory. The thought stayed with him as the night deepened and the firing outside grew sporadic again. The House of Death, as the men on both sides had begun to call the city, demanded everything and gave almost nothing in return. It turned soldiers into survivors who measured their days in rooms cleared and comrades still breathing. It turned ordinary buildings into places where the smallest acts of kindness, sharing water, dragging a wounded man to safety, speaking a few quiet words, became the only light in the darkness. Carl carried his letter and the memory of every man he had helped or watched fall. Victor carried his wife's letter and the image of the old couple he had moved and the wounded comrade he had stayed with. Neither man knew how long the fighting would continue or what the city would take from them before it was over. They only knew that they had been drawn into a struggle that had narrowed to the space between one wall and the next, and that the only way to endure it was to keep doing the small, human things that the ruins themselves tried to erase. If the raw truth of these room-to-room battles, the sudden violence across doorways, the quiet moments of care between comrades, the way ordinary men were changed by fighting for single floors and single hours, has left you wanting to see what words can only describe, then I want to share something that lets you witness the unfiltered reality behind these stories. For those seeking the true face of war's brutality and the humanity that somehow persisted inside it, there is a special digital collection available that gathers rare, uncensored photographs and footage from the Eastern Front, images and accounts too raw and powerful for platforms like this one to host openly. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the night deepened over the ruined factory, Carl added one more line to the letter he still carried, writing about the boy he had tried to teach and the way the city seemed to swallow everything that entered it. Victor sat with the wounded man until the man's breathing steadied, then returned to his post along the gallery wall. Around both of them the city continued its slow, grinding work of turning men into survivors and survivors into something harder and quieter than they had been when they first crossed the Volga's approaches. The House of Death had not yet finished with any of them. It still had rooms to clear and floors to contest and small acts of endurance to demand from those who refused to let it take the last of what made them human. The ring closed around them in the frozen steppe, turning the city they had fought so desperately to take into a prison from which there would be no escape. Carl felt the change before anyone spoke the words aloud. His unit had been ordered to hold a sector on the western edge of the pocket, a stretch of ruined buildings and open ground that had once been part of the factory district. The fighting had grown quieter in recent days, not because the enemy had grown tired but because something larger had shifted beyond the horizon. Supplies that had arrived by air in thin, uncertain streams now came even less often. The men spoke of relief columns that were said to be pushing toward them from the west, but the voices that passed the news carried less conviction with each telling. Carl sat in the basement of a half-collapsed workshop, his back against a wall that still held the faint smell of machine oil, and listened to the wind moving through the broken windows above. He had stopped adding lines to the letter inside his tunic. There was nothing left to say that the silence had not already spoken. The encirclement had come like a slow tightening of a noose. For weeks the men inside the city had fought room to room, convinced that each building cleared and each street held would bring them closer to victory. Then one morning the radio messages from outside had changed their tone. The voices on the other end spoke of counterattacks and new fronts opening farther away. Carl had listened with the others in his section as the news settled over them like another layer of snow. They were no longer the tip of an advancing spear. They were an island surrounded by an ocean that had risen while they were looking the other way. Some of the men had cursed. Others had simply gone back to cleaning their rifles or sharing the last of the bread that had been airdropped days earlier. Carl had walked outside into the gray light and looked toward the west, where the relief was supposed to come from. The horizon was empty except for the low clouds and the distant sound of artillery that never seemed to get closer. Victor stood on the other side of that same invisible ring. His unit had been part of the forces that had swung wide around the city in the counteroffensive, cutting the last roads and rail lines that still fed the pocket. He had watched the German positions from a distance at first, then moved closer as the noose tightened. The men around him spoke of revenge for the months of street fighting, for the comrades lost in the ruins, for the city that had been turned into a graveyard of buildings. Victor listened but said little. He still carried his wife's letter in the pocket near his heart, though the paper had grown thin from handling. He thought of the old couple he had helped move during the earlier fighting and of the wounded man he had stayed with in the factory gallery. Those small acts had stayed with him longer than the battles themselves. Now, as the pocket formed and the enemy inside began to weaken, he found himself wondering what it would feel like to look into the faces of men who had fought in the same rooms he had fought in, only from the other side. Inside the pocket the cold grew sharper with each passing day. Carl's section was moved to a new position near what had once been an airfield. The planes that had brought supplies now came less frequently, and when they did land they brought fewer sacks and more wounded men being flown out. The rations were cut again. Men began to speak openly about hunger in a way they had not allowed themselves before. Carl shared a small piece of hard bread with a younger soldier who had been hit in the leg during one of the last counterattacks. The boy could not walk far, so Carl helped him to a sheltered corner and stayed with him while the section rotated through the forward positions. They spoke of home in fragments, the boy about his mother's kitchen, Carl about the fields he had walked as a child. The conversation was ordinary and broken, the kind that happens when men need to remember that life existed before the ring closed around them. Victor's unit pushed closer to the outer edge of the pocket. They encountered small groups of German soldiers who had been cut off from the main force and were trying to fight their way back in or out. The fights were short and desperate. Victor saw men who looked as exhausted as the defenders inside the city had once looked. He helped carry a wounded comrade back after one such encounter and thought again of the old couple and the piece of bread the man had pressed into his hand. The small kindnesses did not stop even as the larger violence continued. They simply became quieter, more private, as if the men on both sides understood that the end was approaching and wanted to carry something human with them into whatever came next. The hope for relief inside the pocket flickered and then went out. Carl listened to the radio messages that still reached them and heard the same promises repeated in voices that grew thinner with each transmission. The relief columns were delayed. The weather was too bad. The men inside were told to hold on, to conserve ammunition, to believe that help was coming. Carl stopped believing after the third or fourth message. He saw it in the faces of the officers who passed the news along and in the way the men around him began to look at one another when they thought no one was watching. They were no longer waiting for victory. They were waiting for whatever came after the waiting itself ran out. Victor felt the shift on his side of the line. The attacks his unit launched grew more confident as the resistance inside the pocket weakened. He moved through positions that had once been fiercely contested and found them lightly held or abandoned. The men he captured in these advances were thin and hollow-eyed, their uniforms ragged and their boots falling apart. Victor shared what little food his unit carried with one such group before they were marched back to the rear. The act felt strange and necessary at the same time, as if refusing to offer that small mercy would have cost him something he could not afford to lose. He thought of his wife's letter and of the village he still hoped to return to. The war had narrowed for him as well, from the defense of the entire city to the defense of whatever humanity he could still carry through these final days. Inside the pocket the last of the organized resistance began to crumble. Carl's section was ordered to fall back to a smaller perimeter around the city center. They moved at night to avoid the artillery that now fell more regularly. The cold had become a constant companion that no amount of shared body heat could fully defeat. Carl helped carry the wounded boy he had stayed with earlier, the two of them moving slowly through the ruins while the rest of the section provided what cover they could. The boy spoke less now. His leg had grown worse, and the infection that had set in made every step in agony. Carl spoke for both of them, telling stories about the fields back home and the way the light looked on the river in summer. The words were not for the boy alone. They were for Carl as well, a way to hold on to something that had not yet been swallowed by the pocket. Victor was among the forces that entered the outer edges of the shrinking perimeter. He saw the same ruins he had fought through months earlier, only now the fighting was one-sided and the men who remained were shadows of the soldiers who had once contested every room. He found himself in the same factory district where he had fought alongside the old couple and the wounded man in the gallery. The machinery was still there, twisted and burned, but the men who had defended it were gone or captured. Victor stood for a moment in the long gallery and touched the pocket where his wife's letter still rested. The paper had survived the months of fighting. He wondered whether the stories it contained would still make sense when he returned home, or whether the man who read them would be someone he no longer recognized. The final days inside the pocket were measured in shrinking circles and dwindling supplies. Carl's section was down to a handful of men who could still fight. The wounded boy had been left in a makeshift aid station with others who could no longer walk. Carl visited him when he could, bringing whatever scrap of food or word of comfort he could find. The boy asked about home and about whether the relief would still come. Carl answered with the same quiet lies he had been telling himself for weeks. The lies were the last kindness he could offer. On the night before the end, Carl sat with the boy and read aloud from a letter another man had carried, a letter from a wife who wrote about children waiting and a garden that still needed tending. The words filled the cold basement like a small fire that could not be put out by the wind outside. Victor was part of the unit that accepted the surrender when it finally came. He stood on a road lined with exhausted men who walked with their hands raised and their eyes on the ground. The column stretched farther than he could see, a river of men who had once believed they were part of an army that could not be stopped. Victor searched the faces as they passed, looking for something he could not name. He saw Carl among them, though neither man knew the other's name. Carl walked with the same careful steps he had used in the ruins, his head up and his hands empty. Victor met his eyes for a brief moment as the column moved past. There was no hatred in the look, only the shared recognition of men who had survived the same winter and the same city and had come out on opposite sides of the same ending. Carl felt the weight of the surrender settle over him as he walked. The letter inside his tunic had become the only thing he still carried from the beginning of the campaign. He had not added to it in weeks. There was nothing left to write that the empty road and the raised hands had not already said. He thought of the boy he had left in the basement and of the comrades who had fallen in the rooms and the streets. The shame of surrender was there, but it was mixed with something quieter and more complicated. The knowledge that they had endured as long as any men could endure and that the city had taken everything it could take from them. He walked because there was nothing else left to do, and because walking was still a choice he could make for himself. Victor watched the column move past and felt the same complicated mix of emotions. The victory was real. The pocket had been closed and the army inside it had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Yet the faces he saw were not the faces of monsters from the stories told around fires. They were the faces of men who had written letters and shared bread and carried photographs of children they might never see again. Victor touched his wife's letter through the fabric of his coat and thought of the small kindnesses he had witnessed on both sides of the fighting. The war had not ended with this surrender. It had simply changed shape. The men walking past him would carry what they had lived through into whatever came next, just as he would carry the memory of the factory gallery and the old couple and the wounded man who had spoken of his family in the dark. The army that had been drawn to the Volga had vanished into the snow and the ruins. What remained were the men who had survived the vanishing, the ones who had written the last letters, shared the last pieces of bread, and walked out of the pocket with their hands raised because there was no longer any other choice. Carl walked among them, the letter still inside his tunic and the memory of the boy in the basement still clear in his mind. Victor stood on the side of the road and watched them pass, the letter from his wife still close to his heart and the small acts of mercy he had offered and received still alive in his thoughts. Neither man knew what the next months or years would demand. They only knew that they had reached the end of one chapter in a war that had already begun to write the next one in the same quiet, stubborn language of endurance and loss. If these stories of men who endured the closing of the ring, the German soldier who helped a wounded boy in a freezing basement and the Soviet defender who shared food with captured enemies, have moved you the way they move me, then I want to offer you a way to keep their memory alive. The countless hours of research and careful gathering of these forgotten personal accounts take real dedication, and if you feel called to support that work, even a small tip on Ko-Fi, as little as $1, helps ensure that these human truths continue to reach people who need to hear them. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the last of the column disappeared down the road, Victor turned back toward the city that was no longer a battlefield. Carl walked forward into whatever captivity waited, carrying the letter and the memories that no surrender could take away. The Volga flowed on beyond the ruins, wide and patient, carrying the weight of everything that had been lost and everything that still remained to be lived. The army had vanished. The men had not. And in the space between those two truths lay the story that would shape what came next for everyone who had walked through the fire of the city on the river. The earth itself seemed to hold its breath as the steel giants rolled forward across the rolling fields, their engines drowning out the quiet fears of the men inside. Eric sat in the cramped turret of his tank, the metal still cool from the night, and traced the edge of the letter he had written the evening before. The paper was already smudged from his fingers. He had told his mother about the new machines they had been given, about how the commanders spoke of this battle as the one that would turn everything around after the losses farther south. He had not written about the way his hands had trembled when he climbed into the vehicle that morning, or about the stories the older men told around the fires. Stories of cities turned to ruins and armies that had vanished into the snow. Eric was 22 and had joined later than many of the veterans around him. He had trained on these new tanks and believed, or tried to believe, that their weight and their guns would make the difference this time. The letter was his way of holding onto the world outside the steel shell. He folded it carefully and slipped it into the pocket of his tunic before the order came to move. The fields around them stretched wide and open under a sky that promised rain later in the day. Eric's crew spoke little as they checked their equipment one last time. The gunner, a quiet man from a village near the border, adjusted the sights with the same careful attention he might have given a plow back home. The loader hummed an old tune under his breath, the kind of song that filled silence without asking for conversation. Eric thought of his mother reading the letter by the kitchen window and wondered whether she would sense the things he had left unsaid. The commanders had spoken of the enemy waiting in deep defensive lines, of minefields and anti-tank guns hidden in the folds of the land. Eric had listened and nodded with the others, but in the quiet moments he found himself wondering what it would feel like when the first shells began to fall around them. On the other side of those same fields, Victor stood in a shallow trench that had been dug weeks earlier and reinforced with logs and earth. He had come to this sector after the fighting around the city on the Volga had finally ended. The unit he served with now was different from the one that had held the factory galleries. These men had spent the winter rebuilding and training, and many of them carried the same quiet determination Victor had seen in the faces of those who had refused to leave the ruins. He still kept his wife's letter in the pocket near his heart, though the paper had grown thin from the months of handling. He had added a few lines of his own before the sun rose that morning, simple words about the fields and the way the light looked on the horizon. He did not write about the mines they had helped lay or the guns they had positioned to cover the most likely approaches. Those were things the letter could not carry. Victor had heard the rumors of the coming attack. The commanders spoke of it in briefings that left little to the imagination. The enemy was massing armor in great numbers, preparing to drive a wedge into the salient where Soviet forces had pushed forward after the winter. Victor listened and then returned to his position with the others, checking the anti-tank rifle he had been issued and sharing a piece of bread with the man beside him. The small act of breaking the loaf and passing half across felt ordinary and necessary at the same time. It was the kind of gesture that reminded them they were still men who could offer something to one another even when the world was preparing to tear itself open again. Eric's tank moved forward with the rest of the formation as the morning light strengthened. The ground was soft from recent rains, and the tracks left deep marks in the soil. He kept his eyes on the terrain ahead, watching for the first signs of the defensive lines they had been told to expect. The gunner called out distances and bearings in a steady voice that did not betray the tension Eric could see in the set of his shoulders. When the first artillery shells began to fall, the sound was different from anything Eric had heard before. It was not the sharp crack of field guns but a deeper, rolling thunder that seemed to come from the earth itself. The tank shuddered as a near miss threw up a fountain of dirt and stone. Eric gripped the edge of his hatch and told himself to breathe, to focus on the next movement, the next order. The letter in his pocket pressed against his chest like a small, private anchor. Victor felt the ground shake as the barrage began. He pressed himself lower in the trench and pulled his helmet tighter. The men around him did the same, their faces set in the same expression of grim readiness he had seen in the factory ruins months earlier. The artillery was only the beginning. They all knew the tanks would come next, waves of steel that would try to smash through the minefields and the gun positions and the infantry strongpoints that had been prepared with such care. Victor thought of his wife's letter and of the village he still hoped to see again. He thought of the old couple he had helped during the earlier fighting and of the small kindnesses that had kept him steady when everything else had felt like it was slipping away. Those memories did not stop the fear, but they gave it somewhere to rest. The first tanks appeared on the horizon like dark shapes moving through the haze of dust and smoke. Eric saw them through his viewing slit and felt a strange mix of relief and dread. The waiting was over. The battle had begun in earnest. His gunner called out targets and the tank's main gun fired with a roar that filled the compartment. The recoil shook everything. Eric watched the shell arc toward a Soviet position and saw the explosion throw up more earth. He did not know whether it had struck anything vital. The return fire came quickly, anti-tank rounds that whined past the hole and struck the ground nearby. One hit a tank to their left. Eric saw the vehicle lurch and smoke begin to rise from it. He did not see whether the crew escaped. There was no time. The formation kept moving, and his own tank followed, the engine straining as they pushed through the soft ground. Victor watched the German tanks advance through the smoke. His unit had been ordered to hold their fire until the enemy was closer, to let the minefields and the artillery do their work first. The waiting was its own kind of torment. Victor gripped his weapon and thought of the men who had stood with him in the factory, of the way they had shared the last of their strength when there had been nothing else left. He had survived that. He would survive this. When the order finally came to fire, he rose with the others and took aim at the nearest tank. The shot struck the side of the vehicle and sent a spray of sparks into the air. The tank kept coming for a moment, then slowed and stopped, smoke pouring from its engine compartment. Victor did not cheer. He simply reloaded and looked for the next target, the same way he had reloaded in the long gallery when the fighting had been room to room and the enemy had been only meters away. Eric's tank took a hit that shook the entire hull and filled the compartment with the smell of burning metal. The gunner was thrown against the side and did not move. Eric called his name and received no answer. The loader was already working to clear the gun, his face pale but determined. Eric felt a cold clarity settle over him. There was no room for panic here, only for the next action and the one after that. He helped drag the wounded gunner to a safer position inside the tank and then took over the sighting himself. The world outside had narrowed to the narrow slit of vision and the sound of the engine and the guns. He fired again and again, not knowing whether the shells found their mark, only that stopping would mean the end for all of them. The battle unfolded across the fields in a series of clashes that blurred together for the men inside the machines and the men in the trenches. Eric's tank advanced and then was forced back when a mine damaged the track. They worked under fire to repair it, the loader standing watch while Eric and the remaining crew struggled with the heavy metal. A Soviet infantry team tried to close in during the pause, and the fighting became hand-to-hand around the vehicle until the attackers were driven off. Eric saw one of the Soviet soldiers fall only a few meters away and felt a strange pang that had nothing to do with victory or defeat. The man had been doing the same thing Eric was doing, trying to survive one more hour in a place where survival had become the only measure that mattered. Victor moved with his unit as the German attack pressed forward in some sectors and stalled in others. He helped carry ammunition to a gun position that had been partially buried by a near miss. The men there were exhausted but still firing. One of them passed Victor a canteen without being asked, a small gesture that spoke louder than any order. Victor drank and handed it back, then returned to his position as another wave of tanks appeared through the smoke. The day stretched on in a rhythm of fire and movement, of brief moments of shelter and sudden bursts of violence. He thought of his wife's letter and added another line to it in his mind, words about the fields and the way the men around him kept finding ways to help one another even when the steel storm was at its height. By evening the fighting had not ended, only shifted. Eric's tank was pulled back to a rear area for repairs. The gunner had been evaluated, and the crew was down to 3. Eric sat on the hull in the fading light and watched the smoke rise from the battlefield. He took out the letter and read the last lines he had written. They seemed to belong to another person, someone who had still believed the commander's promises. He folded the paper again and placed it back in his pocket. The battle was not over. The steel had clashed and the earth had been torn, but the outcome was still being decided in the same small, human ways that had always decided such things, by men who kept moving forward because stopping was no longer an option they could accept. Victor's unit held their ground through the night. They took turns sleeping in shifts, one man always awake and listening for the sound of engines or footsteps. Victor sat with his back against the trench wall and thought of the letter in his pocket and of the village that waited somewhere beyond the horizon. He had seen tanks burning and men falling, but he had also seen the way his comrades had shared the last of their water and helped each other when the ground shook. Those small acts had not stopped the steel storm, but they had kept something alive inside the men who performed them. Victor touched the pocket and then closed his eyes for a few precious minutes of rest, knowing that the next day would bring more of the same and that he would face it with whatever strength the night could give him. The clash at Kursk was not a single day of fighting but a grinding contest that stretched across the fields and tested every man who had been drawn into it. Eric and his reduced crew returned to the line the following morning, the tank patched but still carrying the scars of the previous day. Victor's unit received replacements and new orders as the German attack shifted its weight and the Soviet defenses bent but did not break. The men on both sides wrote letters in their minds or on scraps of paper when they could, carrying the words like talismans against the fear that no armor could fully keep at bay. They shared what little they had, water, bread, a quiet word of encouragement, and in those moments the vast battle revealed itself as something made of countless individual struggles, each one as important as the next in the long accounting of who would still be standing when the steel storm finally passed. If the personal stories of men caught in the steel storm at Kursk, the German tanker who kept a letter close while his crew was reduced around him, the Soviet defender who found strength in the small kindnesses shared between comrades, have stirred something in you, then I want to invite you to go deeper with us. For those of you hungry to explore the full, unfiltered reality behind these clashes and the people who lived them, our Patreon community offers exclusive and censored video sections, in-depth podcasts that go further into the personal accounts, raw footage that never makes it to public platforms, and a place to connect with others who share your fascination with the real human cost of history. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the second day of fighting drew to a close, Eric sat once more on the hull of his tank and looked out across the scarred fields. The letter in his pocket had become heavier with each hour, not because of what it contained but because of everything it could not say. Victor stood in his trench and watched the horizon for the next movement of steel, his hand resting on the pocket where his wife's words waited. The battle was far from finished, but something had already shifted in the way both men carried themselves. The steel storm had tested them, and they had answered with the only weapons they truly possessed, the stubborn refusal to let fear or exhaustion have the final word, and the quiet, everyday courage of continuing to stand beside one another when the world tried to tear everything apart. That courage, repeated across thousands of tanks and trenches, was what the fields of Kursk would remember long after the engines had fallen silent and the smoke had cleared. The forests and fields of Belarus opened before them like a wound that had been waiting years to be seen, and the men who advanced into it carried both the hope of home and the fire of everything that had been lost. Victor moved with his unit through the shattered edges of what had once been villages, the trees on either side of the road still bearing the black scars of fire. He had been part of the great offensive that had broken the enemy lines in the north, and now the columns were pushing west with a speed that felt almost unreal after the grinding months around the city on the Volga and the steel fields of Kursk. The land here was familiar in a way that made his chest tighten. He had grown up in a village not far from these forests, and though his own home lay farther east, every burned barn and every empty well reminded him of the stories his grandmother had told about the old country before the war had swallowed everything. He kept his wife's letter in the pocket near his heart, the paper now so soft it felt like cloth against his fingers. He had not added new lines in weeks. There was too much to say and no words that seemed large enough to hold it. The advance was not a clean march of victory. It was a slow, relentless uncovering of what the enemy had left behind. Victor's unit passed through settlements where the houses had been reduced to foundations and the wells poisoned with debris. In one such place they found an old woman sitting alone on the remains of her porch, sorting through a small pile of salvaged pots as if the ordinary act of tidying could push back the emptiness around her. Victor stopped without being ordered and offered her a piece of the bread his unit had been given that morning. She took it with both hands and looked at him for a long moment before nodding once. She did not ask where he was from or what he had seen. She simply ate the bread in small bites, as if she had learned that even good things must be made to last. Victor stayed with her until his comrades moved on, then caught up to them without speaking of what he had done. The small kindness had cost nothing and changed nothing about the larger war, yet it had steadied something inside him that the burned fields had shaken loose. Eric, the young German tanker who had survived the clashes at Kursk, now found himself in a different kind of fight. His unit had been pulled back after the Soviet offensive tore through their lines, and the retreat had become a desperate scramble to stay ahead of the advancing columns. The new tanks that had once felt like the answer to every problem were now mostly abandoned along the roads, their fuel gone and their crews reduced to infantry with rifles. Eric walked with the remnants of his company, his boots heavy with mud from the summer rains. He carried no letter anymore. The one he had kept through the earlier fighting had been lost when his tank was hit and he had been forced to run. In its place he carried a small photograph of his mother that he had taken from the same pocket before the vehicle burned. He looked at it sometimes when the column stopped, not because it offered answers but because it reminded him there was still a world somewhere that had not been reduced to smoke and fear. The German retreat through Belarus was not orderly. It was a series of small groups trying to find roads that had not yet been cut, trying to stay ahead of the Soviet tanks and the partisan bands that appeared from the forests to strike and disappear again. Eric's group had been ordered to hold a crossroads for as long as possible to let other units pass. They dug shallow positions in the soft ground and waited while the sky to the east grew darker with smoke from burning supply dumps. Eric sat with his back against a tree and listened to the older men speak in low voices about what they had seen in the villages they had passed. Some spoke of civilians who had hidden them or shared food. Others spoke of the fear that the advancing enemy would show no mercy after everything that had been done in these same forests and fields. Eric listened without adding his own words. He had no stories of mercy to offer, only the memory of the letter he had once carried and the photograph that now felt too fragile to touch with dirty hands. Victor's unit entered a larger town that had been a regional center before the war. The buildings along the main street were mostly standing, though many had their windows boarded or broken. People emerged slowly from cellars and back rooms as the Soviet soldiers moved through. Some came forward with cautious smiles. Others stayed back, watching with eyes that had learned not to trust uniforms too quickly. Victor found himself in front of a small house where a woman stood holding a child by the hand. The child was perhaps 6 or 7 and looked at the soldiers with the direct, unblinking stare of someone who had already seen too much. Victor asked if they needed help moving anything or finding food. The woman shook her head at first, then changed her mind and asked if someone could help carry water from the well at the edge of town. Victor and 2 of his comrades went with her. They filled buckets and carried them back to the house, the child walking between them as if the presence of armed men had become ordinary. When the water was set down, the woman offered them a small piece of cheese she had hidden away. Victor took it and broke it into shares for his comrades without thinking. The act felt like the most natural thing in the world, even though the larger war was still moving around them like a river in flood. Eric's group reached the same town a day later, or perhaps 2. Time had become difficult to measure in the retreat. They found the Soviet soldiers already gone and the townspeople wary but alive. Eric stood in the square where the water buckets had been carried and felt the strange weight of walking through places his own army had once held and then abandoned. He saw the marks of fighting on some of the buildings and wondered whether the men who had defended them had been like him, young, carrying photographs, hoping the next order would not be the one that ended everything. His group was ordered to keep moving. They did not linger. As they left the square, Eric looked back once and saw the woman and child standing in the doorway of their house. The child raised a hand in a small wave, the gesture so ordinary that it stopped Eric for a moment. He raised his own hand in return before the column pulled him onward. The small exchange stayed with him longer than the orders that followed. Victor's advance continued westward through more forests and more ruined settlements. He began to recognize landmarks from stories his family had told, a bend in a river, a hill that had once held a church. The recognition brought no comfort. It only sharpened the sense that home, when he finally reached it, might no longer exist in any form he could recognize. One evening his unit stopped near a village that had been partially spared. The houses were still standing, though many were empty. Victor walked through the streets with 2 comrades, checking for stragglers or hidden dangers. In one house they found an old man sitting at a table with a single candle. The man had a rifle across his knees but made no move to raise it. He simply watched them enter and then nodded as if he had been expecting visitors. Victor asked if he needed anything. The old man said he needed nothing except to know that the war would not return after the soldiers left. Victor could not promise that. He offered instead to help carry water or find food, the same small offers he had made in other places. The old man accepted the water and then, after a long silence, asked Victor where he was from. When Victor answered, the old man nodded again and said that his own son had gone east years earlier and never returned. He did not ask Victor to look for the son. He simply spoke the name once, as if saying it aloud in the presence of another soldier from the same direction might give the name a place to rest. Eric's retreat took him through the same kind of villages, only from the other direction. His group avoided the larger towns now, moving along forest tracks and back roads to stay ahead of the pursuing forces. They slept in shifts in the trees and ate what they could find or carry. Eric had begun to share the photograph with the others when they stopped. It was not a grand gesture, only a quiet way of reminding them that there were still faces waiting somewhere beyond the smoke. One night a comrade who had been wounded in the leg asked to see the photograph. Eric passed it over. The man held it carefully in his dirty hands and looked at it for a long time before giving it back. He said nothing about his own family. He simply thanked Eric for letting him look. That small exchange of trust felt like one of the last things still connecting them to the men they had been before the retreat began. Victor reached the outskirts of a larger city that had once been a hub of trade and learning. The fighting here had been heavier, and the ruins were more complete. His unit was ordered to clear certain blocks and secure the main roads for the columns still coming from the east. Victor moved through the rubble with the same careful steps he had learned in the factory galleries, checking corners and listening for any sound that did not belong. In one half-standing building he found a small group of civilians who had sheltered in the basement through the worst of the fighting. They were thin and frightened, but they came out when Victor called to them in their own language. One of the women carried a baby wrapped in a blanket that had once been bright but was now gray with dust. Victor helped them to a safer building nearby and left them with what food his unit could spare. The woman thanked him in a voice that barely rose above a whisper. She did not ask his name or where he was going. She simply took the food and turned back to the child, the ordinary act of caring for the next generation more important than any conversation with a soldier. Eric's group was ordered to hold a bridge over a river that marked one of the last natural barriers before the border. They dug in on the near side and waited while the sound of pursuing artillery grew louder behind them. Eric sat with his back against the stone of the bridge and watched the water move below. He thought of the letter he had once carried and of the photograph now in his pocket. He thought of the child who had waved in the town square and of the old man who had spoken his son's name in the village. These were not the stories of victory or defeat that commanders told. They were the small, stubborn threads of human connection that had survived the fire and were now being carried westward whether the men wanted to carry them or not. Eric did not know what waited on the other side of the river or how much farther the retreat would take them. He only knew that the photograph was still there and that the small acts of sharing it or looking at it had become the only ritual that still made sense. Victor's unit crossed the same river days later. The bridge was damaged but still usable, and the engineers had already begun repairs. Victor stood on the span and looked back toward the east, toward the lands that had been liberated and the lands that had been devastated in the process. He thought of the woman with the child, of the old man who had spoken his son's name, of the burned villages and the wells that would need to be cleaned before anyone could drink from them again. The drive west had only begun, and already the price of homecoming was visible in every ruined house and every cautious face that emerged from hiding. Victor touched the pocket where his wife's letter waited and added another line to it in his mind. Words about the river and the way the men around him kept finding ways to offer water or bread or a moment of protection even as the larger war demanded they keep moving. The fire through which they were returning home was not yet finished burning, but the small kindnesses were the only things that kept the flames from consuming everything. If these stories of men moving through fire toward whatever remained of home, the Soviet soldier who carried a letter while helping strangers in ruined villages, the German soldier who shared a photograph while retreating through the same devastated land, have left you wanting to understand the hidden layers and forgotten operations that shaped such moments, then I have something valuable to share with you. For those who want to go deeper into the secret battles, the espionage that moved behind the fronts, and the forgotten heroes whose small acts changed the course of the war, our free email newsletter delivers the powerful ebook The Shadow War, 5 top secret operations that shaped World War II, along with weekly deep dives that bring these hidden stories into the light. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the columns continued westward, Victor walked with his unit across the repaired bridge and into the next stretch of forest. Eric's group crossed the same river farther downstream, their boots wet and their eyes on the horizon ahead. Neither man knew the other's name or story. They knew only that the land they were leaving behind had been changed forever by the fire that had passed through it, and that the land ahead would demand its own price before any true homecoming could be claimed. The small acts of kindness they had performed and witnessed along the way were not recorded in any report or marked on any map. They existed only in the memories of the men who had offered them and the people who had received them. And in those memories, carried forward like letters that could never be fully written or fully read, lay the only proof that something human had survived the fire and was still moving west, one careful step at a time. The streets of Warsaw echoed with the sound of fighting that had no answer from across the river, and the men and women who held those streets carried both the fire of resistance and the growing weight of silence. Lena moved through the basement of a half-ruined apartment building on the western bank of the Vistula, her hand steady on the rifle she had learned to use in the weeks since the uprising began. She was 23, a student before the occupation had closed the universities, and she had joined the Home Army because staying quiet had begun to feel like another form of surrender. Her brother had been taken away years earlier for resistance work, and the last news of him had come through whispered channels that offered no comfort. Lena carried a small notebook in her pocket where she wrote letters she could not send, lines to her parents in the countryside, to friends who had disappeared into the camps, to the future she still hoped might exist beyond the barricades. The notebook had become her way of keeping the ordinary world alive inside the chaos of the city. The fighting had started with hope. The Soviet forces were advancing from the east, and many in Warsaw believed the moment had finally come to rise and drive the occupiers out before the liberators arrived. Lena had been part of a small group that seized a building overlooking a key intersection. They had built barricades from furniture and cobblestones, and for the first days the city had felt alive with possibility. Then the German response had hardened, and the sound of tanks and artillery had grown heavier. The help from across the river had not come. Lena had heard the rumors that the Soviet commanders had been ordered to stop, that political calculations had overridden the immediate need of the fighters. She did not know what to believe. She only knew that each day the sound of distant artillery remained distant, and the city's own guns had to answer alone. In the basement, Lena sat with two others from her group. One was an older man named Jan, a printer who had once run a small shop and now spent his nights repairing weapons with whatever tools they could scavenge. The other was a young woman named Kasia, barely out of school, who had joined because her family's apartment had been destroyed in an earlier raid. They shared a tin of food that had been brought through the sewers from another district. The portions were small, but they divided them evenly without discussion. Jan spoke of the printing press he had hidden before the uprising, and how he hoped to use it again when the city was free. Kasia listened and then asked Lena about the notebook. Lena showed her a page where she had written about the way the light looked on the river at dawn before the fighting began. Kasia read it silently and then handed it back without comment. The small act of sharing the words felt like one of the few things still connecting them to the life they had lost. On the eastern bank of the Vistula, Victor stood with his unit in the ruins of a suburb that had been fought over weeks earlier. He had advanced with the great offensive that had carried them through Belarus and into the approaches to Warsaw, and now his company had been ordered to hold position while higher commands decided the next move. The sound of fighting from the western bank reached them clearly on quiet nights, bursts of small arms fire, the occasional heavier explosion, sometimes the distant wail of a siren. Victor had listened to those sounds for days, and each time he heard them he felt the same tightening in his chest. He had been part of the push that was supposed to bring liberation. He had seen villages freed and civilians emerge from hiding with cautious hope. Now the city across the river was fighting for itself, and his unit remained on this side, guns silent except for the occasional exchange with German patrols on their own bank. Victor thought of the letters he had carried earlier in the campaign, the ones from his wife and the thoughts he had added about the land he was returning to. He had not written anything new since reaching the Vistula. The words felt stuck somewhere between the orders he had been given and the sounds coming from the other side. He spoke with his comrades about it in low voices when they rested. Some said the orders made no sense, that they should cross and join the fight. Others said there were larger reasons, things decided far above their heads. Victor listened to both sides and kept his own thoughts to himself. He had learned in the long months of fighting that orders were not always explanations, and that the men on the ground were left to carry the consequences. He touched the pocket where his wife's letter still rested and wondered what she would think if she knew he was this close to a city that was burning while he waited. Lena's group moved through the sewers that night to reach another position that needed reinforcement. The tunnels were dark and wet, the air thick with the smell of waste and damp stone. They carried what ammunition they could and helped a wounded fighter who could no longer walk on his own. Lena took one arm while Jan took the other, and Kasia led the way with a small lamp. The journey took hours, and by the time they reached the surface the sky was beginning to lighten. The building they entered had been a school before the war. Now it was a strongpoint with sandbags at the windows and a makeshift hospital in the basement. Lena helped settle the wounded man and then went to the roof to take her turn on watch. From there she could see the river in the distance, the far bank still held by Soviet forces that did not move. She wrote a few lines in her notebook by the light of a single candle, words about the waiting and the way hope had begun to feel like another kind of endurance. She did not send the words. She simply folded the page and returned it to her pocket, the same way she had returned every other page. Victor's unit received orders to probe the German positions on their own side of the river. They moved at night, using the cover of ruined buildings and the sound of the distant fighting to mask their movement. Victor found himself in a small group that crossed an open stretch of ground and came under fire from a German machine gun nest. They took cover and returned fire until the nest was silenced. When they reached the position they found only one man still alive, a young German soldier who had been hit in the leg and could not run. Victor helped bind the wound while another comrade searched the area. The German spoke a few words in broken Polish, something about a family waiting back home. Victor did not answer. He simply finished the bandage and then helped carry the man back to their own lines for questioning. The small act of stopping the bleeding felt necessary even though the larger war continued around them. Later, when they returned to their positions, Victor sat in the dark and thought about the Germans' words. He thought about his own family and about the city across the river where other families were fighting without the help that had been promised. The days in Warsaw stretched into a rhythm of attack and defense that wore down the fighters but did not break their will. Lena's group lost the school building after a heavy assault and fell back to another position closer to the old town. They moved through the sewers again, carrying the wounded and what little ammunition remained. In one tunnel they found a group of civilians who had been hiding since the beginning of the uprising. The civilians shared what food they had, mostly dried bread and a few potatoes, and asked for news from the outside. Lena told them what she knew, which was little. She did not speak of the silence from across the river. Instead, she helped distribute the food and listened as one of the civilians, an older woman, spoke of her grandchildren who had been sent to the countryside before the fighting started. The conversation was ordinary in the middle of the extraordinary, and Lena found herself holding onto it like another page in her notebook. Victor watched the smoke rise from Warsaw day after day. His unit had been reinforced and then told to prepare for a possible crossing, only to have the orders changed again. He spoke with officers who seemed as frustrated as the men on the ground. Some said the high command was waiting for the right moment, for the German forces in the city to be weakened further. Others said there were political reasons that had nothing to do with the fighters dying in the streets. Victor listened and then returned to his position, where he helped distribute what supplies had reached them. One evening he shared a small piece of chocolate that had come in a package from home with a young soldier who had never tasted it before. The soldier's face lit up for a moment, and the simple pleasure of that expression stayed with Victor longer than the frustration of the orders. He wrote a few lines in his own notebook that night, thoughts about the chocolate and the way small things could still matter even when the larger world seemed to have stopped making sense. Lena's group was ordered to hold a barricade in the old town as the German pressure increased. The barricade was made of overturned trams, furniture, and rubble, and it had already been attacked several times. Lena took her position behind a section of wall and watched the street ahead. When the next assault came, she fired until her ammunition ran low, then helped carry a wounded comrade back to cover. Kasia was hit during the fighting and died in Lena's arms before they could reach the aid station. Lena stayed with her for a few minutes after the others had moved on, holding her hand and speaking words that had no meaning except that they were spoken. She wrote about it later in the notebook, short lines about the way Kasia had smiled once before closing her eyes, and about the quiet that had followed. The notebook was almost full now. Lena did not know what she would do when there were no more pages left. Victor's unit finally received orders to cross the river in small boats under cover of darkness. They moved at night, the sound of the fighting in Warsaw louder now that they were closer. Victor helped row one of the boats, his hands steady on the oars while he listened to the bursts of gunfire and the occasional heavier explosion. They reached the western bank and took up positions in the ruins, expecting to link up with the Polish fighters. Instead, they found only scattered groups and the signs of a defense that had been pushed back street by street. Victor helped secure a small area near the river and then stood watch while others searched for survivors. He found a young Polish fighter who had been wounded and could no longer move. The man was barely conscious, but he managed to say a few words about his unit and about the waiting that had gone on too long. Victor carried him back to the boats and helped get him across to the eastern bank for medical care. The act felt like the smallest possible answer to the larger silence, but it was the only one he could offer in that moment. The uprising in Warsaw ended in the ruins of the old town after weeks of fighting that had exhausted both sides. Lena's group was among the last to lay down their arms. She had one page left in her notebook. She wrote on it by the light of a single match before the surrender, words about the sound of fighting that had never been answered and about the courage that had still managed to fill the silence. She folded the page and placed it with the others, then walked out with the survivors into the streets that were no longer theirs. Victor watched from the eastern bank as the last fighters emerged and were taken away. He had crossed too late to change the outcome, but he had seen the cost of the waiting in the faces of the wounded and the exhausted. He touched the pocket where his wife's letter still rested and added another line to it in his mind, words about the river and the way the sound of fighting had finally stopped, leaving only the quiet that comes after something has been lost that could not be saved. If these stories of courage in the face of silence, the Polish fighters who held their barricades while help remained on the far bank, the Soviet soldiers who crossed too late and carried the memory of that delay, have moved you the way they moved me, then I want to share a way to honor the courage of those who fought by exploring authentic World War II memorabilia or experiencing the epic storytelling of the film Midway on Prime Video, drawing a powerful parallel between the sacrifices on the Eastern Front and the global fight against tyranny. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Lena walked through the ruins with the other survivors, her notebook still in her pocket and the memory of Kasia's smile still clear in her mind. Victor stood on the eastern bank and watched the last of the fighting fade into the distance. The sound that had filled Warsaw for weeks was gone, replaced by a silence that would take years to fill. Both of them carried what they had lived through into whatever came next, the small kindnesses offered in basements and tunnels, the letters written but never sent, the quiet resilience that had turned ordinary people into fighters who refused to let their city disappear without a struggle. That refusal, even in the face of a silence that should never have existed, was what remained when the guns finally fell quiet and the river flowed on between two banks that would never again be the same. The border was crossed without fanfare, the boots of men who had marched across their own ruined land now stepping onto soil that had sent armies east for years, and the silence held only until the first village came into view. Victor felt the change in the air before he saw the first German farmhouse. His unit had been part of the great push that had carried them through the shattered forests of Belarus and past the silent banks of the Vistula, and now the orders had come to keep moving west. The land here looked different, neat fields bordered by tidy fences, houses with intact roofs and shuttered windows that still held glass. It was the kind of order that made the destruction they had left behind feel sharper by contrast. Victor walked with his rifle slung and his thoughts turning over the same questions that had followed him since the first days after Stalingrad. He had seen his own villages burned, his own people driven from their homes, and now he was walking into the homeland of the men who had ordered those things. The satisfaction he had expected to feel was there, but it was tangled with something heavier, something that made every step feel less like victory and more like walking into a story that had no clean ending. He thought of the letter from his wife that he still carried, the one that had traveled with him through the factory ruins and the steel fields of Kursk and the long advance that had finally brought them here. He had not added new lines in weeks. The words he might have written now felt too large for paper, words about crossing into the place that had sent the fire eastward, words about the faces of civilians who appeared at windows and then disappeared again as the column passed. Victor touched the pocket where the letter rested and kept walking. Around him the men spoke in low voices about what they had already seen, abandoned farms with livestock still in the barns, cellars stocked with food that had been left behind in the rush to flee. Some of the soldiers took what they needed without asking. Others left it untouched, remembering the orders that had come down about discipline and the need to show that this army was not the same as the one that had come before. In a small village just beyond the first border markers, a German woman named Elke stood at the window of her kitchen and watched the column move past. Her husband had been called up years earlier and had not returned from the east. Her 2 children, a boy of 10 and a girl of 7, were hidden in the cellar with instructions not to make a sound. Elke had heard the stories from refugees who had passed through weeks earlier, stories of villages burned in revenge, of soldiers who took what they wanted and left nothing behind. She had packed what she could into a single suitcase and hidden the rest under the floorboards, but she had not left. The thought of abandoning the house her husband had built had felt like another kind of surrender. Now she stood at the window and tried to read the faces of the men marching past. They looked tired. Some looked angry. A few glanced toward the house and then looked away again, as if they were not yet ready to see what waited inside. Victor's unit stopped for the night in a field outside that same village. The men set up a rough perimeter and began to cook what food they had carried. Victor sat with 2 comrades who had been with him since the early days of the counteroffensive. One of them, a quiet man from a village near Victor's own, spoke of the farms they had passed and how much they looked like the ones that had been destroyed back home. He did not say the word revenge, but it hung in the air between them. Victor listened and then stood up. He walked toward the village with no clear plan except to see what was there. The streets were nearly empty. A few doors opened as he passed, and faces appeared and then withdrew. He stopped at the house where Elke stood watching. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Victor asked, in the few words of German he had picked up, if she needed anything carried or moved. Elke stared at him as if she had not understood. Victor repeated the question more slowly. She shook her head at first, then pointed to a stack of firewood that had been left beside the door. Victor carried it inside without being asked again. When he finished, he nodded once and turned to leave. Elke called after him and offered a piece of bread she had kept hidden. Victor took it, broke it in half, and handed one piece back to her before walking away. The exchange lasted less than a minute, but it stayed with both of them longer than the marching that followed. The advance continued deeper into German territory, and the complications multiplied with every kilometer. Victor's unit passed through towns where the population had fled in such haste that dinner plates still sat on tables and children's toys lay scattered in yards. The men found letters in some of the houses, letters from soldiers at the front, letters from wives waiting at home. Victor read one such letter by the light of a single candle in a kitchen that still smelled of fresh bread. The words were simple, a husband writing about the cold and the longing to see his children again. Victor folded the letter and placed it back where he had found it. He did not take anything from the house except the memory of those words. Later that night he sat with his comrades and listened as some of them spoke of the things they had seen in their own villages years earlier, the burned homes, the bodies in the streets, the families driven into the snow. The stories were told without anger now, only with a quiet exhaustion that made the act of crossing this new border feel less like justice and more like walking through a mirror that showed the same destruction from the other side. Elke remained in her house with her children. She had heard from neighbors who had risked the roads that the Soviet columns were not burning everything in their path as the rumors had claimed. Some soldiers were taking food and livestock, but others were leaving what they found and even helping with small tasks when asked. Elke did not know what to believe. She kept the children in the cellar during the day and only let them come up after dark. One evening she heard footsteps on the path and opened the door to find 2 Soviet soldiers standing there. They were young, barely out of their teens, and they looked as tired as the men she had seen marching earlier. One of them pointed to the well and made a gesture of drinking. Elke nodded and showed them how to draw the water. While they drank, she asked, in the broken German she had learned from her husband, whether they had families. The younger soldier nodded and pulled a photograph from his pocket. It showed a woman and 2 small children standing in front of a wooden house. Elke looked at it for a long moment and then handed it back without speaking. The soldiers finished their water and left without taking anything else. Elke closed the door and sat at the kitchen table until the children came up from the cellar. She did not tell them what had happened. She simply sat with them until they fell asleep and then wrote a letter to her husband that she knew she would never be able to send. In it she described the soldiers who had asked for water and shown her a photograph, and she wrote that the war had begun to feel like something that was happening to ordinary people on both sides of the line. Victor continued with his unit as the advance pushed farther west. The orders about discipline were repeated often, but they were not always followed. In one village, a group of soldiers broke into a house and took what they found. Victor heard the shouting and went inside to find an older couple pressed against the wall while their belongings were scattered across the floor. He stepped between the soldiers and the couple without raising his voice. He spoke of the orders and of the need to show that this army was different from the one that had come before. The soldiers looked at him for a long moment and then left without taking anything more. Victor helped the couple gather what had been thrown on the floor. The old man offered him a cup of water and asked where he was from. Victor answered with the name of his village, and the old man nodded as if the answer had confirmed something he already suspected. They did not speak of the larger war. They spoke instead of the weather and of the way the fields here looked in summer. When Victor left, he felt the same complicated weight he had carried since crossing the border, the sense that revenge and mercy were no longer simple opposites but 2 sides of the same exhausted coin. The Red Army's arrival on German soil did not bring the clean satisfaction that some had expected. It brought instead a landscape of contradictions, well-fed livestock in barns that had been left behind by families fleeing east, letters from soldiers at the front that spoke of the same homesickness Victor had felt in his own letters, civilians who emerged from hiding with the same cautious hope he had seen in the villages his own army had liberated months earlier. Victor wrote a new page for the letter he carried, describing the tidy farms and the faces at the windows and the way the land itself seemed to hold its breath as the column passed. He did not write about the moments of excess or the moments of restraint. He wrote instead about the photograph the young soldier had shown Elke and about the old man who had asked where he was from. Those were the details that had stayed with him, the ones that made the crossing feel less like the end of a journey and more like the beginning of something that would require new words to describe. Elke kept the children close and listened to the sounds of the column moving farther west. She had begun to believe that the worst rumors had been wrong, or at least not entirely right. The soldiers who had stopped at her door had taken only water and left the rest untouched. Other neighbors reported similar encounters, soldiers who helped with chores or shared food when asked. There were also stories of houses looted and worse, but those stories came from farther away, from villages where the discipline had broken down or where the anger had run too deep to be held back by orders. Elke wrote in her unsent letter that the war had become something smaller and more personal than the maps suggested. It was no longer only about armies and fronts. It was about soldiers who carried photographs and civilians who offered water, and about the way both sides were learning, in the middle of the fire, that the enemy had faces and families and homes that looked remarkably like their own. Victor's unit pushed on toward the next river and the next set of villages. The land continued to change, the fields giving way to denser forests and then to the outskirts of larger towns. Victor walked with the same steady pace he had maintained since the first days after Stalingrad, but the questions inside him had grown more complicated. He thought of the woman who had offered bread after he carried her firewood, of the old man who had asked about his village, of the photograph shown in the kitchen. These were not the stories that would be recorded in reports or marked on maps. They were the small, stubborn acts that happened between the lines of the larger advance, the moments that reminded every man who witnessed them that the war had not yet succeeded in stripping away everything human on either side of the border. Victor touched the pocket where his wife's letter rested and kept walking. The soil under his boots was German now, but the weight he carried was the same one he had carried since the first village burned back home. The weight of knowing that every step forward was also a step through the consequences of everything that had come before, and that the only way to keep moving was to hold on to the small mercies that still appeared, unasked for, in the middle of the fire. If the raw truth of these first days on German soil, the complicated mix of revenge and restraint, the faces at windows and the photographs shared across kitchen tables, has stayed with you the way it stays with me, then I want to share something that lets you see what words alone can never fully capture. For those seeking the unfiltered reality behind these stories, there is a special digital collection available that gathers rare, uncensored photographs and footage from the Eastern Front. Images and accounts too raw and powerful for platforms like this one to host openly. It reveals the true face of war's brutality and the humanity that somehow endured inside it. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the column moved deeper into the new territory, Victor looked back once at the village where he had carried firewood and accepted bread. The house still stood, its windows shuttered against the coming night. Elka sat at her kitchen table with her children and read again the letter she would never send. Neither of them knew how far the advance would carry or what the next weeks would demand. They knew only that the border had been crossed and that the soil on this side of it now held the same complicated mixture of loss and endurance that had marked every kilometer since the first fires had been lit years earlier. The men who walked that soil carried both the fire they had survived and the small, stubborn lights they had found along the way, lights that no order could extinguish and no map could show, but that continued to appear, one careful step at a time, as the war moved west. The rubble of Berlin had become a classroom where boys barely old enough to shave were taught in a single afternoon how to aim a weapon that could stop a tank, and the lesson came with no promise that they would live to use what they had learned. Young Hans stood in the courtyard of what had once been his school, now a collection point for anyone still able to hold a weapon. At 15 he was tall for his age but thin from months of rationing, and the Panzerfaust they placed in his hands felt heavier than anything he had ever carried. The instructor, an older soldier missing one arm, showed them how to brace the tube against the shoulder and how to sight along the simple line painted on the side. There was no time for practice rounds. The men who gave the orders spoke of duty and of the fatherland's need, but Hans heard only the tremor in their voices and saw the way their eyes avoided the faces of the boys in front of them. He thought of his mother waiting at home with his younger sister, of the letter his father had sent from the Eastern Front months earlier that still lay folded in the kitchen drawer. He had read that letter so many times the creases were soft. It had spoken of coming home when the war was won. Now the war had come home instead, and Hans was being sent out to meet it with a weapon he barely understood. He walked back through streets he had once known by heart. The buildings were hollowed out, their windows empty or boarded, and the air carried the constant low rumble of artillery from the east. At the corner where he used to meet friends after classes, an old man sat on a crate sharpening a bayonet. The man looked up as Hans passed and gave a single nod, the kind of silent acknowledgement that had replaced ordinary greetings in these last weeks. Hans nodded back. He did not know the man's name, but he recognized the look in his eyes, the same look his mother wore when she pretended not to notice how little food remained in the cupboard. At home, his mother was waiting in the kitchen. She had heard the orders for every male over 14 and had tried to hide his school papers, as if paperwork could keep the war from finding him. When he came through the door with the Panzerfaust, she did not scream or weep. She simply took the weapon from his hands, set it carefully against the wall, and pulled him into an embrace that lasted longer than any hug he could remember. His sister watched from the doorway, clutching a doll that had lost most of its stuffing. Hans told them he had been given an important task, that he would be back soon. The lie tasted familiar now. He had told similar lies to friends whose brothers had already gone and not returned. That night he sat at the kitchen table and tried to write a letter to his father. The paper was the same kind his mother used for ration cards. He wrote that he was well and that the family was safe, then stopped because both statements felt like betrayals of the truth. He folded the unfinished page and slipped it into his pocket beside the small photograph of his father in uniform that his mother had given him years earlier. Outside, the sky glowed with the light of fires that never seemed to go out. Hans lay on his bed fully dressed and listened to the distant thunder of guns. He thought of the stories older boys had told about the Eastern Front, about tanks that appeared without warning and soldiers who fought until there was nothing left to fight with. He wondered whether his father was still out there somewhere or whether the silence from the front meant something worse. Sleep came in short stretches, broken by the sound of his own breathing and the occasional voice calling from the street below. In the morning he reported to a ruined apartment block near what had once been a park. Other boys were already there, some even younger than he was, along with a handful of older men who moved with the stiff caution of those who had already seen too much. They were divided into small groups and assigned positions among the rubble. Hans was paired with a boy named Lucas who had lost an older brother at Stalingrad and spoke of it with a quiet anger that made the weapon in his hand seem like the only answer left. They were shown a narrow alley between two collapsed buildings and told that Soviet tanks would likely come through there. The Panzerfaust was to be used at close range, they were told, because that was when it worked best. Hans listened and nodded, but his mind kept returning to the kitchen and the way his mother had held him. He wondered whether she was still sitting at the table or whether she had gone to the cellar with his sister as they had practiced. The thought of them waiting in the dark while he waited here in the light made the weapon feel even heavier. Victor's unit had reached the outer districts of Berlin days earlier. The city that had once been the heart of the enemy now lay in front of them like a broken machine still trying to turn. Victor had seen many ruined places in the years since Stalingrad, but Berlin felt different. The resistance here was not only from soldiers but from the city itself, barricades made of streetcars and furniture, strongpoints in every cellar and every upper floor. He had watched tanks from his own side burn when boys no older than his own son appeared from the rubble with Panzerfausts and fired at point-blank range. The first time it happened he had felt a cold anger at the waste of it, at the regime that would send children to die rather than admit defeat. Then he had seen the face of one such boy after the shot was fired and the boy realized what he had done. The look had not been triumph. It had been the stunned emptiness of someone who had just crossed a line he could never step back over. Victor had ordered his men not to fire on the boy as he ran back into the ruins. The order had cost nothing and changed nothing about the larger battle, but it had stayed with him. Hans and Lucas waited through the morning in their alley. They spoke little. Lucas cleaned the Panzerfaust again even though it was already clean. Hans kept one hand on the photograph in his pocket and tried to picture his father's face the way it had looked in the last letter. When the first Soviet tank appeared at the end of the alley, the sound of its engine filled the narrow space like thunder. Hans raised the Panzerfaust the way he had been shown. His hands shook so badly that Lucas had to help steady the tube. The tank came closer, its machine gun firing into the rubble on either side. Hans closed one eye and tried to remember the instructor's words about leading the target. He squeezed the trigger. The backblast threw dust and smoke into the alley, and for a moment he could see nothing. When the smoke cleared, the tank was still moving, though smoke now poured from its engine compartment. It had not stopped completely. Lucas fired his own weapon a moment later and the tank lurched to a halt. Two figures climbed out of the hatches. One of them was on fire. Hans looked away. Lucas was already reloading. The sound of more engines came from beyond the alley. They had been told to hold this position as long as possible. Netherboy asked how long that might be. Victor heard the explosion and saw the smoke rise from the alley ahead. His tank commander ordered the vehicle forward to support the infantry clearing the street. As they approached, small arms fire came from the upper floors of the ruined buildings. Victor kept his head down and watched the alley. A boy, no older than 14, appeared from behind a pile of rubble with another Panzerfaust. The boy was crying as he tried to aim. Victor's gunner called out a warning, but Victor placed a hand on his arm. The boy fired and missed. The backblast knocked him to the ground. Before he could rise, Victor's tank had rolled past and the infantry following behind had the boy covered. Victor climbed down and walked to where the boy lay. The Panzerfaust had fallen a few meters away. The boy looked up at him with eyes that held no defiance, only exhaustion and a fear so deep it had no room left for anything else. Victor helped him to his feet. The boy did not resist. He simply stood there, shaking, while the fighting moved farther down the street. Victor spoke to him in the few words of German he had learned, telling him it was over, that he should go home if he still had one. The boy nodded once and then sat down on the rubble as if his legs would no longer hold him. Victor left him there with a canteen of water and returned to his tank. He did not look back. Hans and Lucas held their position through two more attacks. Each time the tanks came closer and the return fire grew heavier. Lucas was hit in the arm during the third exchange and could no longer lift his weapon. Hans helped him to a sheltered corner and gave him the last of the water they had carried. Lucas asked him to tell his mother what had happened if he survived. Hans promised, though he knew the promise was as thin as the paper in his pocket. When the next tank appeared, Hans fired alone. The shot struck true this time. The tank stopped, but the machine gun on its hull continued to fire until someone inside silenced it. Hans dropped the empty tube and pressed himself against the wall. His ears rang. His hands were burned from the backblast. He thought of his mother and sister in the cellar and of the unfinished letter. For the first time since he had been given the weapon, he allowed himself to wonder whether any of them would still be alive when the guns finally stopped. Victor's unit cleared the street building by building. In one cellar they found a family huddled together, an old woman, a younger woman, and two small children. The younger woman held a photograph of a man in uniform and would not let it go even when the soldiers searched the room. Victor spoke to her gently, telling her they meant no harm to civilians. She looked at him for a long moment and then asked, in careful Russian she must have learned somewhere, whether the war was finally ending. Victor nodded. She did not smile. She simply gathered the children closer and waited for the soldiers to leave. Later, when the unit stopped to rest, Victor sat with his back against the wall and thought of the boy in the alley and the family in the cellar. He thought of his own son, safe for now in a village far to the east, and of the letters he had written promising to come home when the fighting was done. The promises felt heavier here in the ruins of the enemy's capital. He took out the letter from his wife and read it again by the fading light. The words had not changed, but the meaning had. Home was no longer just a place waiting on the other side of victory. It was something that had to be carried through every ruined street and every encounter with children holding weapons they should never have been given. Hans was found the next morning by a Soviet patrol. He was still in the alley, sitting beside Lucas, who had died during the night. The Panzerfaust lay where he had dropped it. The soldiers searched him, found the photograph and the unfinished letter, and then helped him to his feet. One of them gave him a piece of bread and a canteen. Hans ate without tasting anything. He was taken to a collection point where other boys and old men were being gathered. He did not know what would happen next. He only knew that the sound of the guns had moved farther away and that the city around him was quieter than it had been in weeks. He thought of his mother and sister and hoped the seller had kept them safe. He thought of his father and wondered whether the letter he had never finished would ever reach him. The war had come to his doorstep and asked him to defend it with a weapon meant for soldiers. He had done what he was told. Now the telling was over, and all that remained was the waiting. Victor watched the last resistance in that sector fade as more of his unit moved through the streets. The boys with Panzerfausts had been the final, desperate measure of a regime that had run out of everything else. Some had fought with a courage that belied their age. Others had fired once and then run or surrendered. Victor had seen both. He had seen the cost on his own side as well, tanks lost to point-blank shots, men killed by children who had been told this was how wars were won. The city was falling street by street, but the price of that fall was being paid by people who had never chosen any of it. He thought of the boy he had helped to his feet and of the family in the cellar. He thought of the unfinished letter in his own pocket and of the promises he had made to his wife. The promises would have to be kept in a world that had been changed by every ruined building and every child who had been handed a weapon in the final days. Victor touched the letter once more and then turned back to his men. There was still ground to take and people to protect where they could. The guns had not yet fallen silent everywhere, but in the quiet spaces between the firing, the small acts of mercy and the quiet recognitions of shared humanity were the only things that still made sense. If these stories of boys sent to fight tanks with weapons they had only just learned to hold, and of the soldiers on both sides who carried the weight of those encounters long after the guns moved on, have moved you the way they moved me, then I want to offer you a way to keep their memory alive. The countless hours of research and careful gathering of these forgotten personal accounts take real dedication, and if you feel called to support that work, even a small tip on Ko-Fi, as little as $1, helps ensure that these human truths continue to reach people who need to hear them. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Hans sat on the curb outside the collection point and watched the smoke rise from buildings farther west. A Soviet soldier walked past and dropped another piece of bread into his lap without speaking. Hans ate it slowly. Across the street a group of civilians emerged from a cellar and began to clear rubble from the sidewalk. Among them was a woman who looked like his mother from a distance. He stood up and took a step toward her before he realized it was not her. He sat back down. The war had asked everything of him and of everyone around him. It had taken his school, his friends, his father's absence, and now it had taken the last of his childhood in an alley where tanks burned and boys fired weapons they should never have been given. What remained was the waiting and the small, stubborn acts of kindness that appeared even here: bread shared without asking, water offered to a stranger, a hand extended to help someone stand. Those acts did not end the war. They simply refused to let the war have the final word on who these people had been before the rubble and who they might still become after the guns finally fell silent. The concrete corridors beneath the burning city had become a world unto themselves, where the man who had once moved armies across continents now moved only between a map room and a private chamber, while above him the last defenders of Berlin fought with the desperate courage of those who had nothing left to lose. Victor crouched behind the shattered wall of what had once been a government building and watched the Soviet tanks grind forward through streets choked with rubble. He had been with the same unit since the long retreat from the Volga, through the steel fields of Kursk and the forests of Belarus, and now the final prize lay only blocks away. The air smelled of cordite and burning wood and the faint, sickening sweetness that came from bodies left too long in the heat. Victor's hands were steady on his rifle, but his mind kept returning to the faces he had seen in the last days: old men in makeshift uniforms, boys no older than his own son holding weapons they barely knew how to use, and civilians emerging from cellars with eyes that held both terror and a strange, exhausted relief. He thought of the letter from his wife that he still carried in his pocket, the one that had traveled with him across thousands of kilometers of ruined land. He had not added to it in weeks. There was too much to say and no words that seemed large enough to hold the reality of what they were walking into. Deep beneath the chancellery, in a bunker that had been designed for protection but now felt more like a tomb, Adolf Hitler moved through his final hours with the same restless energy that had once driven entire nations. He had married Eva Braun only the day before in a small ceremony witnessed by a handful of aides. The wedding had been quiet, almost ordinary, as if the two of them were trying to claim one last fragment of normal life before the world closed in. Eva had worn a simple dress and smiled for the photographs that were taken. Hitler had spoken his vows in a voice that still carried traces of the commanding tone he had used in stadiums filled with cheering crowds, but now the words echoed only against concrete walls lined with maps that no longer matched the reality outside. In the hours after the ceremony, he had dictated his political testament to one of his secretaries, a young woman named Trottel who had served him for years. She wrote the words down with steady hands even as the building above them shook from Soviet artillery. When he finished, Hitler thanked her and told her she should try to escape if she could. Trottel had nodded, but she knew there was no escape left for any of them who remained in the bunker. She had seen the fear in the eyes of the generals and the quiet despair in the faces of the women who had stayed to the end. She had also seen small moments of unexpected kindness, a cup of tea offered to a trembling aide, a hand placed on a shoulder when words failed, the way Eva Braun had quietly comforted one of the secretaries who could no longer hold back tears. Victor's unit pushed forward again as night fell. The streets were lit by the glow of fires that had been burning for days. They encountered pockets of resistance in every block, snipers in upper windows, machine gun nests behind barricades made of burned-out vehicles and furniture. Victor and two other men cleared one such position by moving through the cellars of adjacent buildings, emerging behind the defenders and taking them by surprise. Among the captured was an old man in a tattered uniform who could barely stand. Victor helped him sit and offered him water from his own canteen. The man drank slowly, his hands shaking, and then looked at Victor with eyes that held no hatred, only exhaustion. He spoke a few words in broken Russian, something about having a son who had been taken prisoner years earlier. Victor did not know what to say. He simply nodded and helped the man to his feet when the others moved on. Later, when they stopped to rest in the shell of a burned-out shop, Victor thought about that moment. He thought about all the small exchanges he had witnessed in the final days, Soviet soldiers sharing bread with German civilians who emerged from hiding, a young German boy who had been forced to fight and who had surrendered without resistance, the way his own comrades had sometimes looked away rather than fire on someone who clearly could not fight back. These were not the stories that would be told in official reports, but they were the ones that stayed with him when the guns fell silent for a few minutes at a time. In the bunker, the atmosphere grew heavier with each passing hour. Hitler received reports of the city's collapse and of the failed attempts to relieve the capital. He raged at generals who could no longer promise victory, then retreated into long silences. Those closest to him noticed the change. His hands trembled more visibly now, and his voice had lost the magnetic quality that had once held crowds spellbound. Eva Braun remained at his side, offering quiet support in the small ways she could, making sure he ate when he forgot, sitting with him when the maps no longer made sense. One of the secretaries later recalled how Eva had taken the time to comfort a young aide who had broken down after delivering particularly bad news. She had spoken to him gently, as if he were a frightened child rather than a soldier in the final hours of a collapsing regime. These small acts of care stood in stark contrast to the larger collapse happening above them, where the last defenders fought street by street with weapons that were running out of ammunition and hope. Victor reached the area around the Reichstag as dawn broke on one of the final days. The great building was already scarred from earlier fighting, its dome broken and its walls pockmarked with bullet holes. Soviet soldiers were preparing to raise a flag on the roof, a symbolic act that would mark the end of the long road from the Volga to the heart of the enemy capital. Victor watched as two men climbed the ruined stairs with the banner. He thought of all the places they had fought, the frozen fields outside Moscow, the hell of Stalingrad's factories, the steel clashes at Kursk, the long drive through Belarus and into Poland, and now here. He thought of the comrades who had not made it this far, of the villages that had been burned and rebuilt in the minds of those who survived, of the civilians who had emerged from cellars with the same cautious hope he now saw in the faces of Berliners who dared to come out into the daylight. When the flag went up, there was no great cheer from his unit. The men simply watched in silence, some nodding, others looking away as if the moment was too large to hold in a single glance. Victor touched the letter in his pocket and allowed himself, for the first time in years, to imagine writing the words that would tell his wife the war in Europe was finally ending. Deep in the bunker, Hitler and Eva Braun prepared for the end they had both chosen. They said their goodbyes to the remaining staff, some of whom were given permission to try to escape through the Soviet lines. Hitler gave capsules of poison to those who asked and spoke briefly with each person who remained. His manner was calmer than it had been in days, as if the decision had brought a strange kind of peace. Eva Braun, who had chosen to stay with him rather than flee, sat quietly in the small sitting room, her face composed. One of the secretaries later described how Eva had taken the time to write a short note to a friend outside, a final act of ordinary connection in the middle of extraordinary circumstances. When the moment came, Hitler and Eva retired to their private quarters. The shot that ended Hitler's life echoed through the bunker corridors like a final punctuation mark on years of war and suffering. Those who remained carried the bodies to the garden above, doused them in fuel, and set them alight as Soviet shells continued to fall around the chancellery. The flames rose into a sky already heavy with smoke from the burning city. Victor's unit moved through the government district in the hours after the flag had been raised. They encountered small groups of surrendering soldiers and civilians who had hidden in the underground stations and cellars. Victor helped clear one such group from a subway tunnel where families had sheltered for days. Among them was a young woman holding a child who could not have been more than 3. The woman was trembling, but when Victor offered her water she accepted it with a quiet thank you in German. He did not understand the words, but he understood the look in her eyes, the same exhausted relief he had seen in so many faces across the long advance. He thought of his own family waiting far to the east and of the promise he had made to come home when the fighting was done. The promise had carried him through every battle, every frozen night, every moment when it would have been easier to stop. Now, standing in the heart of the city that had once been the source of so much destruction, he felt the weight of that promise settling into something quieter and more lasting. In the bunker, those who remained after Hitler's death faced their own choices. Some chose to end their lives as he had. Others attempted to break out through the Soviet lines, with varying degrees of success. Trottel, the young secretary who had taken the final dictation, was among those who survived the escape attempt. She would later speak of the small acts of courage she had witnessed in those final hours, the way people had helped one another despite their own fear, the quiet dignity some had maintained even as the world they had known collapsed around them. She had seen the human side of people who had been part of a machine of destruction, and she had also seen the ordinary humanity that persisted even in the darkest moments. Those contradictions would stay with her long after the war ended. Victor stood on the steps of the ruined Reichstag as the sun set on the day the flag had been raised. The city around him was still burning in places, and the sound of sporadic fighting could still be heard in the distance. But for the first time in years the horizon felt different. He took out the letter from his wife and read it one more time by the fading light. The words were the same as they had always been, news of home, expressions of love, hopes for the future, but now they carried the weight of everything he had survived to read them again. He thought of the boy with the Panzerfaust who had surrendered without resistance, of the old man who had spoken of his lost son, of the family in the subway tunnel and the young woman who had thanked him for water. These were the stories that would not appear in any official history, but they were the ones that had kept him human through the long years of fire and loss. He folded the letter carefully and returned it to his pocket. The war in Europe was ending, But the work of living with what had been done and what had been lost was only beginning. If these final days in Berlin, the quiet acts of care inside a concrete tomb, the exhausted relief of soldiers who had marched across a continent, the small moments of humanity that appeared even as the world burned, have left you wanting to go deeper into the personal stories behind the great events, then I have something valuable to share with you. For those of you hungry to explore the full, unfiltered reality behind these clashes and the people who lived them, our Patreon community offers exclusive and censored video sections, in-depth podcasts that go further into the personal accounts, raw footage that never makes it to public platforms, and a place to connect with others who share your fascination with the real human cost of history. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Victor turned away from the Reichstag and walked back toward his unit. The city that had been the center of so much suffering was now quiet in patches, the way a storm quiets between gusts of wind. Somewhere in the ruins, survivors were beginning the long process of emerging from cellars and tunnels. Somewhere far to the east, families were waiting for letters that would finally carry news of peace rather than another battle. And somewhere in the space between those two realities, the men and women who had lived through the fire were carrying the small, stubborn lights of human connection that no regime and no war had been able to extinguish completely. The man in the bunker was gone. The city above him was broken but still breathing. And the soldiers who had come to end the nightmare were learning, one careful step at a time, that the real work of peace would be measured not in victories won but in the ordinary acts of care and recognition that would have to be rebuilt from the rubble of everything that had been lost. The guns had fallen silent across a continent of ruins, but for the men and women who had walked through fire for 4 long years, the real test was only beginning. A long walk home through landscapes that no treaty could restore and memories no victory could erase. Victor stood on the platform of a crowded train station that had once been the gateway to his village, his duffel bag heavy with the few possessions he had carried across the length of the war. The journey home had taken weeks of waiting for transport, of hitching rides on trucks and walking stretches of broken road when no vehicle appeared. He had watched the countryside change from the flat plains of the west back into the familiar rolling hills of home, yet nothing looked quite as he remembered. Villages that had once been whole now showed gaps where houses had stood, fields that should have been green with summer crops lay patchy and untended. Victor touched the letter from his wife that he still carried in his pocket, the same one he had read and reread through every battle from the Volga to Berlin. He had written nothing new on its pages in the final months, because the words felt too small for what he had seen. Now, as the train slowed and he stepped onto the platform, he wondered what shape those words would take when he finally sat at a table and tried to tell her everything. His village had survived in pieces. The school where he had learned to read still stood, though its roof had been patched with scavenged tin. The well in the square still gave water, but the old men who once gathered there to talk about the harvest now sat in smaller groups, their voices lower, their eyes quicker to scan the road for strangers. Victor walked the familiar lane to his house with steps that grew slower the closer he came. He saw his wife before she saw him, standing at the gate with their son on her hip, her face turned toward the sound of the arriving train. When their eyes met, she did not run to him. She simply set the boy down and waited, as if she had practiced this moment in her mind so many times that the real one felt almost ordinary. Victor dropped his bag and crossed the last distance in a few long strides. He lifted her off her feet the way he had imagined doing for years, and for a moment the weight of everything he had carried since leaving home lifted with her. Their son watched from the ground with wide eyes, too young to remember the father who had left but old enough to sense that something important had changed. In the days that followed, Victor learned the shape of the new quiet that had settled over the village. Neighbors came by with small gifts, a loaf of bread baked from the first harvest, a jar of preserved vegetables, a bundle of letters that had arrived while he was away. They asked few questions about the war. Instead, they spoke of who had returned and who had not, of the fields that needed clearing of mines and the children who had grown up without fathers. Victor listened more than he spoke. He noticed how his wife's hands had grown rougher from work that had once been shared, how his son now looked to other men in the village for the small lessons a father would have given. At night, when the house was still, he sometimes woke to the sound of artillery that was no longer there, or reached for his rifle only to remember it had been turned in weeks earlier. His wife would place a hand on his arm without speaking, and the touch would steady him until sleep came again. These were the small kindnesses that no report would record, the ordinary acts of care that allowed a man to begin piecing together a life from the fragments the war had left behind. Far to the west, in a town that had once been part of Germany and was now under new administration, Elka stood at the window of the same kitchen where she had watched Soviet columns pass months earlier. Her husband had not returned from the Eastern Front. The letters she had written to him had come back unopened, marked with stamps she did not recognize. Her children played in the yard with the cautious energy of those who had learned to stay close to home. Elka had spent the first weeks after the fighting stopped sorting through what remained, hiding the uniform her husband had left behind, burning the papers that might draw unwanted attention, learning the new rules that governed food distribution and movement. She had seen neighbors arrested for things they had said or done during the war, and she had seen others welcomed back because they had quietly helped the resistance or simply because they had survived. The line between those who were punished and those who were not felt arbitrary, drawn by people who had not lived through the same nights of fear. One afternoon a Soviet officer came to the house. He was young, no older than Elka's lost husband had been when he left, and he spoke with a tired politeness that surprised her. He asked if she had any weapons or documents from the old regime. Elka showed him the empty drawer where her husband's papers had once been kept. The officer nodded and then asked, almost as an afterthought, whether she needed help repairing the roof that had been damaged in the final days of fighting. Elka hesitated, then accepted. The officer returned the next day with 2 soldiers and a small supply of wood and nails. They worked without speaking much, and when they finished the officer left a small packet of food on the table without being asked. Elka watched them walk away and felt a complicated mix of gratitude and resentment, the same tangle of emotions she had seen in the faces of her neighbors who had also accepted help from the new authorities. She wrote a letter that night to a cousin in another town, describing the officer who had fixed her roof and the way her children had watched the soldiers with a mixture of fear and curiosity. She did not send the letter. She folded it and placed it with the others she had written and never mailed, a small archive of a life that was still finding its new shape. In a camp far to the east, a man named Sergei who had been taken prisoner in the early days of the war sat on a wooden bench and waited for the list of names to be called. He had survived years of forced labor in German factories and mines, years of hunger and cold and the constant fear that each day might be the one that broke him. When the camp was liberated, he had been too weak to stand at first. The Soviet soldiers who found him had given him food and water and helped him onto a truck that carried him to a collection point. Now he waited with hundreds of other former prisoners for transport home. Some of the men spoke of the families they hoped were still waiting. Others said nothing, their eyes fixed on the ground as if they had already learned that hope could be dangerous. Sergei thought of his wife and the small son he had left behind. He had no letters from them, none had reached him in the camp, and he did not know whether they had survived the occupation or the fighting that had swept across their region. When his name was finally called, he stood slowly, gathered the small bundle of belongings he had managed to keep, and walked toward the truck that would begin the long journey back. The road home for Sergei was not a straight line. The truck broke down twice, and he walked stretches of damaged highway alongside other men who had once been enemies and were now simply survivors sharing the same uncertain future. They spoke little at first, but as the days passed, small exchanges began, sharing a piece of bread, offering a hand when someone stumbled, telling a story about a village or a family member that made the long miles feel shorter. Sergei learned that one of the men walking beside him had been a guard at a camp where Soviet prisoners had been held. The man spoke of the orders he had been given and the fear that had kept him from questioning them. Sergei listened without anger. He had seen enough in his own captivity to understand how ordinary men could be pulled into terrible things by forces larger than themselves. When they parted ways at a crossroads, the former guard pressed a small carved wooden figure into Sergei's hand, a bird he had made during the long nights of waiting. Sergei carried it in his pocket for the rest of the journey, a reminder that even in the darkest places, hands could still create something gentle. Victor's village began to change in small, visible ways as more men returned. Fields were cleared of the last mines by teams of soldiers and civilians working together. The school reopened with a new teacher who had lost her husband in the fighting around Kursk. Children who had grown used to hiding during air raids now played in the square again, their laughter carrying the same careless joy that had filled the air before the war. Victor helped repair the roof of a neighbor's house one afternoon, working alongside men he had known since childhood. They spoke of the harvest that would come in the autumn and of the new roads that were being planned to connect the village to the larger towns. No one mentioned the years of absence or the empty places at tables. The work itself became the conversation, the steady rhythm of hammers and saws, a language that needed no translation. When the roof was finished, the neighbor's wife brought out a bottle of homemade spirits and poured small glasses for everyone. Victor raised his glass with the others and drank to the roof, to the coming harvest, and to the quiet fact that they were all still here to see it. Elka's children began to ask questions she could not fully answer. The boy wanted to know when his father would come home. The girl asked why the soldiers who had fixed the roof spoke a different language and wore different uniforms. Elka told them what she could, that their father had gone to fight and that many men who went to fight did not return, that the new soldiers were there because the old ones had lost the war. She did not speak of the fear she still felt when she heard boots on the path outside, or of the nights she lay awake wondering whether her husband's body lay in one of the unmarked graves that had appeared across the landscape. Instead, she focused on the small tasks that made each day possible, mending clothes, tending the garden that had been neglected during the fighting, teaching the children the songs she remembered from her own childhood. These ordinary acts became her own form of resistance against the larger forces that had upended their lives. Sergei reached his village on a clear autumn morning. The train stopped at a siding a few kilometers away, and he walked the final distance with the carved bird still in his pocket. The house where he had lived with his wife and son was still standing, though the garden had grown wild and the front gate hung crooked on its hinges. He knocked on the door and waited, his heart beating harder than it had during any battle. When the door opened, his wife stood there with flour on her hands and a look of disbelief that slowly turned into something deeper. She did not speak at first. She simply stepped forward and put her arms around him, and for a long moment the years of separation collapsed into the space between them. Their son appeared from the back room, taller than Sergei remembered, with eyes that held the cautious watchfulness of a child who had grown up without a father. Sergei knelt and held out the carved bird. The boy took it carefully, turning it over in his hands as if it were something fragile and precious. In that small exchange, Sergei felt the first true sense that he had come home, not just to a place, but to the people who had waited for him through every long night of captivity. The long walk home was never only a matter of distance. For Victor, it was the slow work of learning to sleep without reaching for a weapon, of teaching his son the names of trees and the rhythms of the fields, of finding new words for the things he had seen. For Elka, it was the daily negotiation with uncertainty, new rules, new neighbors, the constant awareness that the past could still reach into the present. For Sergei, it was the gradual rebuilding of trust, in his own body, in the safety of ordinary days, in the possibility that the carved bird his son carried might one day be passed to another generation without the shadow of war hanging over it. These were not victories that could be marked on maps or celebrated in parades. They were the quiet, stubborn victories of people who had been asked to endure more than any person should have to endure and who had found, in the smallest acts of care and connection, the strength to begin again. The price of victory was visible everywhere, in the empty chairs at tables, in the scars on bodies and minds that would never fully heal, in the borders that now divided families and villages that had once been whole. Yet the price was also paid in the countless small moments that never appeared in any official record: the soldier who shared his last crust of bread with a stranger, the widow who planted flowers where a tank had once crushed her garden, the child who learned to laugh again after months of silence. These were the threads that held the torn fabric of life together when everything else had been stripped away. They were the reason the long walk home, however difficult and however long, was still a walk worth taking. If these stories of survivors finding their way through the ruins, the soldier returning to a changed village, the woman rebuilding a life under new rules, the prisoner learning to trust the ordinary light of day again, have stirred something in you, then I want to invite you deeper into the hidden layers behind the great events. For those who want to explore the secret operations, the forgotten heroes, and the personal accounts that shaped the course of the war in ways no battlefield map could show, our free email newsletter delivers the powerful ebook The Shadow War, 5 top secret operations that shaped World War II, along with weekly deep dives that bring these stories into the light. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Victor stood in his field one evening as the last light faded and watched his son run between the rows of new crops, the carved bird from another man's hands clutched tightly in his small fist. Elka planted flowers by the repaired roof and taught her children the names of the stars that had watched over them through the worst nights. Sergei sat at his table and listened to his wife read from the letters she had saved, the words filling the space that years of separation had left. None of them knew what the next years would bring, the new divisions, the new fears, the slow work of memory that would turn the fire they had survived into stories they could one day tell without the old pain rising in their throats. They knew only that they had walked the long road home and that the small, stubborn acts of kindness they had given and received along the way had become the foundation on which whatever came next would have to be built. The war had taken almost everything. It had not taken the capacity to care for one another in the quiet spaces between the ruins. And in that capacity, carried forward one careful step at a time, lay the only victory that could never be taken away.